Chapter 279. The giant ship shook slightly, in a layer of clear and transparent water. But in fact, it was thick and heavy, appeared out of thin air, enveloping the entire ship. This was the first time that a high-level Tao formation and a forbidden spell from another world had clashed head-on. However, Han Jin had gained a huge advantage. Since the rules of Tao were still effective, then water would definitely be able to suppress fire. From the perspective of magic alone, the five elements formation set up by Han Jin could be said to be the nemesis of most magic. No matter if it was a fire-forbidden spell or an earth-forbidden spell, they would definitely have their own unique attributes. Furthermore, the five elements formation was constantly circulating and could transform the power of the five elements into a type of elemental force at any time. After Han Jin sensed the fluctuation of the fire element, he immediately changed the five elements formation into a water formation, which could generate fire, and the Jin wood formation could evolve into leaf fire with the same amount of elemental force. After the leaf fire formation absorbed the leaf fire, it could evolve into earth with double the amount of elemental force. Earth could generate gold, and gold could generate water. Finally, the power of the five elements would all be transformed into 5 times the amount of water, which was enough to resist any pure fire magic. Even if Han Jin used all the 3 true fire talismans he had on him, it would still be difficult to pose a threat to this water formation. The 3 true fire was not an ordinary fire, and the water formation was also not ordinary water. The flames crazily attacked and tore at the water formation, but it was still unable to burn away the endless water formation. In the flickering, colorful light, balls of bright flames were unwillingly extinguished, and there were also streams of water formation that turned into water vapor, floating onto the deck of the ship, and then seeping into the depths of the deck. As long as the five elements formation was still operating, these water vapor would once again turn into Jin wood, then into leaf fire, and finally back into water formation. The inexhaustible flames were only because the area they covered was too large. The magic power of a mage was limited, and the offensive power of the flames was also limited. However, the five elements formation was truly inexhaustible. Everyone on the ship remained silent. They had only heard of ships sailing on the sea, and Han Jin had already created a miracle by making the huge ship fly into the sky. Now they were witnessing another miracle. The surroundings had turned into a pure sea of fire, but they couldn't feel any heat. On the contrary, it was very cool here. Flames and water collided, tangled, and finally stirred together. This could be considered a spectacle. Perhaps it would be difficult for them to see a similar scene in their lifetime. At the very least, it would be impossible for them to be as calm and peaceful as they were now. Of course, all of this was because Han Jin was here. Otherwise, no matter how powerful Guevara and Jedis were, being able to ensure their own safety in the revelation of the Abyss was already a miracle. How would they have the mood to enjoy the show? The Minotaur shaman on the ground laughed wildly. Other than the powerful black dragon, he did not think that any creature could survive the revelation of the Abyss. However, the bull-headed priest only laughed for a moment before his laughter came to an abrupt end. In his field of vision, the giant ship steadily pierced through the fire clouds, surrounded by a thick layer of multicolored light, appearing incomparably sacred. This. The Minotaur shaman could hardly believe his eyes. A green light flew down from the giant ship and immediately turned into a giant sword that was dozens of meters long. It slashed down with great force. However, in a real battle, Han Jin would not easily release the flying sword slash because of the trauma in his heart. However, in the face of a stationary target, his flying sword could produce incomparable power. Harley, who was happily hammering away, was startled and hurriedly dodged to the side. With a loud boom, the 2 layers of magic shields couldn't withstand the ferocious attack and collapsed almost at the same time. Then, pillars of lightning fell from the sky and enveloped the abyssal mages, whether they were standing, lying, or lying down. A few of the abyssal mages hurriedly released magic shields, but their magic was already exhausted. Soon, they screamed under the continuous pillars of lightning. As for the unconscious abyssal mages, they had no ability to defend themselves. As soon as the first wave of lightning fell, they turned into mutilated corpses. The Minotaur shaman managed to hold on for a little longer, but unfortunately, it was only a little longer. Under the endless lightning, his magic shield finally collapsed, and his entire life turned into an unwilling scream. Asterisk, 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 near the City Lord's mansion in Fort Maxine, there was an unusually tall house. According to human standards, a 2-meter tall door would be enough, but the door of this house was more than 3 meters tall and nearly 2 meters wide. It seemed to have been specially built for someone. In the main hall, a tall and burly monster with an extremely ugly face was eating in big mouthfuls. His movements were very rough. He did not use his knife and fork, but used his hands to grab a handful of food. Occasionally, he would pick up the wine jug and drink a few mouthfuls. He was very busy, but also very happy. However, his right arm was broken at the elbow, and there was no support for his long sleeve, which fluttered around, giving him a desolate feeling. The corner of the monster's eyes occasionally glanced to the left. There was a big bed there that was different from the others. There was no bedding, no sheets, and the bare bed emitted a metallic luster. There was a woman lying on the bed. To be precise, it was a young girl with a delicate face and long silver hair that exuded a strange aura. The young girl was also very tall, almost 3 meters tall. Just her slender and muscular legs alone were comparable to the height of an ordinary human woman. Compared to the young girl and the monster, the busy servants in the house were no different from dwarves. The monster suddenly stopped eating and was stunned for a moment. He stood up, walked over to the metal bed, and sat down. He smiled at the servants and said, "Get out, all of you. Hurry up." The servants hurriedly put down the things in their hands and quickly left the room. The monster told them what to do because he was in a good mood. If it was in the past, someone would have been lying in a pool of blood. The monster looked at his oily hands and casually wiped the girl's chest a few times. The light green dress that was originally filled with a light aura became extremely dirty in a few moments. "Girl, I can't take it anymore. What do you think I should do?" The monster bent down and said with a grin. The wording was not important, and neither was the tone. The problem was that when the monster spoke, droplets of saliva dripped from the corner of its mouth and landed on the girl's face, making her feel extremely disgusted. The young girl kept her eyes closed and squeezed out a sentence from between her teeth. "You demons. Chasam will never let you go." "Chasam?" The monster paused for a moment, then laughed wildly. He laughed so hard that he rocked back and forth. After a while, he stopped laughing and said in a mocking tone, "I heard that you are very strong and have truly grasped the power of lightning. In a few years, perhaps even Chasam will have to give up his position. Is that right? It's good that you know." The young girl took a deep breath. "Let me go now, and we can continue to negotiate. Otherwise, you will suffer the wrath of Chasam." Tisk tisk. The monster did not mind the filth. He reached out with his left hand and pinched the young girl's dirty chest. "Little fool, you still don't understand what I mean. Your strength is already a threat to Chasam, isn't it?" The cold smile on the young girl's face suddenly disappeared, and her body stiffened. How cute! The monster became more and more impudent, and the range of his left hand increased. "I'll tell you the truth. Zagund has already formed an alliance with Chasam. As for you, you are Chisam's first condition. Do you understand?" The young girl suddenly opened her eyes. Her gaze was as cold as a knife as she stared at the monster's face. "Do you think I will believe your nonsense? Chasam would never do such a thing unless he wants to be despised by the entire Titan tribe. If even you don't believe it, do you think your tribesmen will?" The monster laughed loudly. "Even if we tell them, he will have countless reasons to defend himself. Haha, he is much smarter than you. I don't believe it." The young girl's tone was still very resolute, but her eyes flickered as if she was thinking about something. The monster didn't know how to flirt. It moved its left hand a few times and actually reached into the girl's forbidden area under her skirt. As the girl twisted and struggled fiercely, The monster pulled hard and tore off a ball of soft silver fur. Because of the color, one could clearly see that there were still traces of blood at the root of the fur. Finally, the monster put the fur in front of its thick nostrils and took a deep sniff. It opened its ferocious mouth and laughed wildly. Scram! The young girl screamed as she struggled. No matter how strong she was still a young girl. When faced with a threat, she was as weak as a normal person. Scram? Who are you telling to scram? The monster's face turned cold, and he gave the young girl a heavy slap. His ugly face was scary when he smiled, and even scarier when he was cold. The monster then grabbed the young girl's hair and said word by word, "Little fool, listen carefully. At this time, I have no reason to lie to you. Chasem wants you to die. However, us brothers don't want to do as he wishes. If you are obedient and serve us well, we will let you live. At least, we will give you a chance for revenge. If you're not obedient, we will not only play with you, we will also kill you. Understand? Then you will have nothing." The first part of what he said was true, but the second part was pure nonsense. Chasem was not an idiot. He had made the first request, and the second plan could only be carried out if the first request was confirmed. That monster only spouted nonsense because it saw that the other party was pure and easy to bully. Think about it. They were both top-tier creatures of the continent. How much of a boastful thing would it be to make the other party bow down to him like a female slave? There was no point in forcing himself on her. Although the monster was very rough in some aspects, he was also very ambitious in other aspects. The girl's pupils had already turned silver. Her hands, which were bound to the side of the bed, scratched the bed frame with all her might, and actually left claw marks on the metal bed frame. However, her hands and legs were still firmly fixed by the black crystal wires. No matter how much strength she exerted, she couldn't move an inch. Damn it! The monster did not have much patience. Seeing that the young girl was not going according to his plan, he finally lost his patience. He reached out and tore off the young girl's skirt. However, at this moment, a strong magical wave came from afar. The monster was stunned. This is the revelation of the abyss. Chapter 280. Han Jin steered the giant ship, which was the newly named god of war, and slowly approached Fort Maxine. During the confrontation, Han Jin had withstood the test of the forbidden spell and wiped out hundreds of abyssal mages who had exhausted their magic power. Of course, he would take advantage of this victory and go straight to the source of the problem. The four Bite Man City lords all wanted to be the only ruler of the Bite Man. Of course, they were also constantly on guard against being swallowed up by others. Although the main city's defensive facilities were not as thorough and strict as the Holy Crown cities, they were still considered small-scale. Seeing the god of war slowly approaching their airspace, the sound of horns rang out in the city, and a giant magic shield slowly opened, enveloping the entire city. Hogan, Kane, and the others were adjusting the magic crystal cannons. To deal with this kind of giant magic shield, they had to use the magic crystal cannons. The magic power of a person was limited, and there were a lot of magic crystals stored in the ship's cabin. From the high ground, they could freely fire the cannons. The defensive magic array of Fort Maxine would definitely not last long. At the same time, Lang Ning's army was also slowly approaching Fort Maxine. Once the magic shield was broken, they would immediately launch an attack. As they got closer and closer, the people below were like a group of ants running around in panic. Unfortunately, the god of war had the absolute advantage. No matter what kind of attack the soldiers of Fort Maxine launched, it was already very good if they could even touch the hull of the god of war. There was no threat at all. At this moment, there was a fluctuation in the air, followed by a strange distortion in the space in front of the god of war. Then, a monster about 3 meters tall with an extremely ugly face appeared there. He was holding a bone scythe in his hand, and his cold eyes were fixed on Han Jin. It wasn't because of Han Jin's handsome appearance that the monster was jealous of. Everyone on the ship was standing, except for Han Jin, who was sitting on the armchair, surrounded by a group of people, giving the impression that he was the moon surrounded by a myriad of stars. Everyone knew the saying, "To catch bandits, first catch the ringleader. The monster grinned strangely, and then his figure disappeared strangely. Abyssal demon, Guevara let out an angry roar. At this moment, his combat energy had been released to the extreme. His whole body was covered in golden light, as if he was a god of war wearing golden armor. The dragon spear in his hand burst out a dazzling light, and even the tip of the spear condensed into a flickering light blade that was a few meters long. Guevara had dealt with the abyssal race before, so he knew better than anyone else how terrifying the abyssal demons were. Therefore, the moment he saw the abyssal demons, he chose to unleash his full power. Jed's also stopped smiling and immediately cast Absolute Barrier on himself. A scepter with flowing light appeared in his hand. This was the first time everyone had seen Jed's take out his weapon. The scepter's shape was very ordinary, but the flowing light was particularly dazzling. At the top of the scepter was a magic crystal as white as jade, and there was a sculpture of a little angel on it. The little angel's sculpture was very lifelike. The moment Jed's took out the scepter, only those with the sharpest eyesight could see that the little angel's eyes had quietly opened. Yelena also cast a magic shield on herself, and Majordomo Gale took a step forward and stood beside Yelena. Their closeness could only be clearly shown when facing a test. The air seemed to have stagnated. Maybe it was 1 second, maybe 2 seconds. The monster suddenly appeared in front of Han Jin, waving its huge scythe and slashing down with a whistling sound. Too arrogant, too crazy. The same thought flashed through the minds of everyone who saw this scene. Although the abyssal demons were terrifying, the god of war was also a place where powerhouses gathered. Han Jin, Guevara, Jed's, Majordomo Gale, and Yelena were all top and super powerhouses. How could an abyssal demon challenge the 5 of them? Moreover, it was an attack without any fancy moves. This was crazy to the point of stupidity. Among the 7 brothers of the abyssal demon whip, the youngest brother, Salav, was very unfortunate in the first half of his life. When he was still young, he was implicated by his brothers. His right hand was cut off by his clansmen and he was driven out. In fact, he did not violate the rules of the demons, nor did he have the opportunity to do so. Because of this, the brothers had always felt guilty toward Salav. They took care of him and spoiled him. For example, they first sent the female Titan to Fort Maxine, and when Salav was done playing with her, it was the other brother's turn. Even if Salav played with the female Titan to death, the other brothers would not have any complaints. All these factors had nurtured Salav's arrogant character. However, Salav's combat power was not to be underestimated. He had been using his only left hand to control his weapon, and the other brothers had long been used to it. When it came to a real battle, they always felt uncomfortable. Han Jin opened his eyes, and a ray of green light shot out, blocking the scythe firmly. It was true that there was no harm in being careful. Han Jin knew that he was not a cultivator who entered the path of cultivation through martial arts. In terms of reaction and speed, he could not compare to a real warrior. Therefore, every time he faced a conflict, the first thing he would do was to buff himself with the spirit possession technique. This time, he did the right thing again. Because the speed was too fast, the shape of the scythe had become blurry. In an instant, it was close to Han Jin's head. However, green glow was already waiting there, and Han Jin's hand was already on the hilt of green glow's sword. His speed was definitely not slower than Salav's. With a loud bang, the scythe was bounced up high by a huge force. Han Jin let out a muffled groan, and green glow involuntarily slapped towards his own head. However, his divine telekinesis had already reached the realm of being able to control it freely. With a slight thought, green glow suddenly turned into a small ball of light, and the force attached to green glow also disappeared. Guevara roared angrily, and the dragon spear moved at full speed. The blade of light at the tip of the spear instantly approached Salav's chest. Before the tip of the spear arrived, the surging wind had already blown Salav's rarely combed red hair straight. Jed's raised his scepter, and 2 extremely small rays of light shot out from the little angel's eyes, directly hitting Salav's cheeks. Major Domo Gale swung his hand, and a ray of black light shot out. No one said that a thief had to use a dagger to kill. Looking down on the strong in the world as if they were nothing, sooner or later, they would pay the price for their arrogance. At this moment, Salav was facing an extremely fierce counterattack from the three strong opponents. Salav was stunned. He never thought that the opponent would be able to block his all-out attack. By the time he realized that there were several strong opponents on the ship who were enough to pose a threat to him, it was already too late. At the very least, he couldn't block Jed's attack. The two small rays of light shot into Salav's left cheek and came out from the right. Coincidentally, they also shot into Morrison's. However, Morrison's didn't feel anything unusual, but Salav let out a miserable cry, and then his figure disappeared without a trace once again. Running, Han Jin sneered and suddenly stood up from his chair. The next moment, Salav appeared on the side of the god of war, looking at the people on the ship with a pair of fierce eyes. Just as he was about to say something, Han Jin had already cast a spell. His figure flashed and suddenly appeared in front of Salav, and a green ray of light shot toward Salav's chest. The heart of a lion, the cowardice of a rabbit. These words were suitable to describe Salav. He had become a bird that was startled by the mere twang of a bow. As soon as Han Jin's figure appeared, he immediately released a teleportation spell to avoid Han Jin's attack. The strong people on the god of war saw a shocking scene. Salav released a few teleportations and finally returned to the ground. Every time he moved, Han Jin could instantly close in on Salav. However, Han Jin's attack was always half a beat slower. Raphael, when did he learn how to teleport? Kane said stutteringly. On the flat field, Salav and Han Jin stood there quietly. One was no longer chasing, and the other was no longer running. In fact, what Han Jin released was not a teleportation spell, but a shrinking spell. Salav's teleportation spell could be released immediately, but it required a certain amount of time to change space and appear at the desired location. On the other hand, Han Jin's shrinking spell required a spell to release, but he could disappear and reappear at the same time. Compared to Salav's teleportation spell, both had their own strengths and were equally matched. Seeing that he could not hurt Salav, Han Jin had to temporarily give up on attacking and find another way. Jedis floated down from the sky. Only he could help Han Jin. Yelena's strength was slightly weaker, and it was very likely that she would be in danger. I'll remember you, Salav sneered, but his smile was somewhat miserable, and his voice was unclear. Jedi's attack had caused a penetrating wound on his face, and the wound was still expanding. Salav endured the pain and stayed behind to talk nonsense, because he felt that it was too embarrassing. To some people, this was stupid, but to Salav, it was necessary. He could not escape with his tail between his legs. Jedis, go back, Han Jin said slowly. Jedis? Ha! I'll remember you too. Salav's gaze fell on Jedis again. Jedis shrugged. He would not take this kind of threat to heart, but he faintly felt that Han Jin wanted to do something. Since Han Jin asked him to step aside, he would do so. Abyss Demon? I have to admit that your ability is very special, Han Jin said softly. You may cause us trouble. Are you scared? Salav felt that his self-esteem had been somewhat restored, and he laughed wildly. However, his laughter suddenly stopped, and he looked coldly at Han Jin. I have to tell you, it's too late. I'm really afraid of trouble, so it's not too late at all. Han Jin's voice was very gentle. He took out a talisman from a space ring and quietly looked at it. If you run now, you may still be able to make it. Huh. Salav let out a contemptuous laugh. If he wanted to escape, no one could force him to stay. He had full confidence in his ability. Just like just now, he had escaped from a life-or-death situation. I'm kidding. It's already too late. Han Jin smiled, revealing 2 rows of neat teeth. His tone became even gentler, as if he was coaxing a little brother next door. Red Lotus. Bloom. The talisman in Han Jin's hand suddenly turned into a glowing red lotus. As Han Jin chanted, the petals flew out in all directions. Each petal was rapidly changing. 1 petal turned into 2, 2 into 4, 4 into 8. In just an instant, The 1,000-meter radius around Hanjin had completely turned into a sea of flowers. This was an extremely beautiful world. Every petal was emitting a gentle light. They chased each other, danced, and played with each other. It was so beautiful that it was dazzling and mesmerizing. However, Salav was not in the mood to enjoy the beautiful scenery. His tone was arrogant, but his heart was extremely nervous. As early as when the first petal floated up, he had already used teleportation. Unfortunately, when he changed his space, he suddenly realized that the whole world was filled with beautiful red lotus petals. Salav used teleportation again, but the place where he appeared was still filled with countless petals. When the petals fell on him, it did not hurt at all. On the contrary, it made him feel a sense of joy from the depths of his heart. However, Salav's mind was very firm. He gritted his teeth and used teleportation. Everyone would grow and mature. In the past, Hanjin really did not have any skills in combat. Now, he was no longer the same as before. He had discovered Salav's fatal weakness. The distance of teleportation was too close, and it was impossible for him to escape the attack range of the red lotus fire. Although it was not easy to make such a talisman, Hanjin did not care about anything else in order to completely eliminate the abyssal demon that was very likely to be a threat to them. Hanjin silently looked at Salav, who was flashing around from time to time. The latter only wanted to escape and didn't notice that his legs, arms, chest, and back were rapidly shrinking in the intoxicating joy, to the point where his white bones were exposed. After another teleportation, Salav was close to the edge of the whirling sea of flowers. He only needed to use his instinct twice in a row to escape. However, he felt that his body had lost its balance, and he fell to the ground involuntarily. At this time, he realized that the flesh on his left foot had all disappeared, and he could clearly see that his bones were turning into dust bit by bit. Salav had never seen such a strange and shocking scene. He opened his mouth and wanted to shout, but he found that he could not make any sound at all. Even the scythe in his left hand had become tattered, as if it had gone through the baptism of thousands of years. Salav struggled for a few times and slowly lay down in the gentle petals. He opened his mouth and revealed an ugly smile because he realized that death did not seem to be as terrible as he thought. After that, Salav did not move anymore. The petals that were emitting light were still dancing in the air. Soon, Zolof's body turned into a skeleton. Finally, it turned into dust and disappeared completely. Even the scythe had turned into dust. There was almost no trace of its existence left behind. There was only a transparent magic crystal that was half the size of a fist. Hanjin stretched out his right hand and waved it gently. The petals flew like a tide toward Fort Maxine in the distance. The magical defense circle of Fort Maxine only lasted for a moment before it was destroyed by the wave of petals. All the soldiers and magicians on the city walls showed a strange smile at the same time. Their souls were not as strong as Salav's. Before their bodies could fall to the ground, they had already turned into dust. Chapter 281. When Hanjin stepped onto the city wall, the dancing petals of the red lotus finally began to wither, turning into scattered light spots and completely disappearing into the air. On both sides of Hanjin, within 1,000 meters of the city wall, there was no one left. However, there was a lot of dust rolling around in clusters. The red lotus of hellfire first damaged one's soul. If one couldn't resist the attack of the red lotus of hellfire, one's body and soul would be destroyed. His master had repeatedly warned him that the red lotus of hellfire was harmful to the harmony of heaven and earth. If he was still in that world, Hanjin might have thought twice, but here, harmony of heaven. If he let the abyss demon escape and let him use his special instincts to take revenge, what if Sunir, Morrison's, and the others died in the hands of the abyss demon? What was the meaning of harmony of heaven? Kill. Seeing that the raging rain of flowers had disappeared, the soldiers of Fort Maxine regained their courage and rushed towards the city wall along the street. Hanjin stepped on the battlements with one foot and quietly looked at the flow of people below. Suddenly, a faint emotion emerged in his heart. Compassion. This was the compassion of the strongest to the weakest. Of course, if it was the abyssal race that rushed over, this long street would have been stained with blood. Han Jin sighed. He was a little dispirited and didn't want to do anything. However, if he didn't do anything, someone else would. A ferocious fire dragon fell from the sky and landed on the long street. The dozens of soldiers who rushed in front screamed at the same time. Although the heavy armor they wore was excellent, it couldn't block out the high temperature at all. One by one, they turned into people on fire, struggling and struggling. A pair of wings made entirely of flames flapped nonstop. The fire dragon rampaged along the long street, and everywhere it passed, there was a raging fire. There were about 500 to 600 soldiers gathered, but they were all destroyed by the fire dragon. They didn't even have a chance to resist. Cain and Yelena stood on Han Jin's left and right. Their faces were red with excitement. The magic released by Han Jin might not be the strongest, but it was definitely the most beautiful. It was even comparable to the legendary miracles. It was unforgettable. Not only the two of them, but everyone on the God of War would remember this scene. In the distance, Riptide's flag was waving slowly, and a black line was pressing down from the sky. Although they didn't make it in time for the real battle, they weren't too late. To be honest, they couldn't have any influence on a high-level battle. Therefore, every lord on the continent was a famous expert, and the real deciding factor was the battle between the experts. Crisp chirps could be heard from the sky. Little gold lightning had brought the Thunderbirds into the airspace above Fort Maxine. There were also hundreds of gargoyles following closely behind the Thunderbirds. Their existence was to provide protection for the Thunderbirds. If the Thunderbirds were to be attacked, they would use their bodies to shield them. I'll leave this place to you. Han Jin's figure flashed and appeared on the street. Han Jin's telepathic thoughts were still unable to scan the situation in the distance, but he and the spirit beast were telepathic. Little gold lightning was his eyes. Just now, Little Gold Lightning had discovered a person who had to use her death to establish the might of Han Jin, Riptide, and a rising force. In the tall house, Fort Maxine's Mayor Wayne stood in front of the iron bed and shouted in a panicked tone, "My lord, this is bad, this is bad." The silver-haired girl looked at Wayne coldly and didn't say anything. Her wrists and ankles were already bleeding, which was the result of her desperate struggle. However, even Guevara, who was at his peak, was imprisoned by this black crystal thread for many years. It was impossible for her to break free immediately. "Sir, you have to help us," Wayne cried out in grief. At this moment, Han Jin's figure rose from the ground like a ghost. He slowly sat down on the chair and looked at Wayne's back with a calm and unruffled look. The girl saw Han Jin and was slightly stunned. Then she said to Wayne in a cold tone, "Why should I help you? You and Zoloff are the same. You are all Zagun's lackeys." "My lord, you didn't know?" Wayne's eyes widened in shock. "Zoloff was acting like a tyrant here and had already angered us. But today I just killed Zoloff with my men and Zagun's army came. My lord, you must help us. We can only rely on you now." Han Jin grinned and turned his gaze to the dining table. Although he had only released a talisman, he had consumed a lot of energy. Out of instinct, he wanted to eat something, but the mess on the table made him lose his appetite. You can kill Zoloff?" The girl couldn't help but smile contemptuously. Although she was young and naive, Wayne's lie was even more naive. "If that's the case, you can go find the person who killed Zoloff. He can definitely stop Zagun's army. Why do you need to find me?" "My lord," Wayne shed tears of grief. "My most valued top-ranked Magus has already died in the battle against Zoloff, my lord." "Top-ranked Magus?" "Lord Wayne, it seems that we need to get to know each other again. You must be the Lord of the Bite Man, right?" The girl was sharp-tongued and didn't leave any room for sarcasm. In his desperation, Wayne's lies became more and more ridiculous. If he really had a top-grade Magus under him, and if he really had the strength and means to control a top-grade Magus, he would have killed his way out long ago. Why would he hide in Fort Maxine? "No, I hate war." Wayne sighed. Han Jin almost laughed out loud. He shook his head and picked up the wine pot on the table. That was drunk by Zoloff. It's very dirty. Maybe it was because Hanjin was very handsome, or maybe it was because he had a free and easy temperament, but the girl had a good impression of Hanjin. She reminded him, if you want a drink, there are clean bottles in the cupboard at the back. Oh, Hanjin looked back and smiled. Thank you. Only then did Wayne and his two guards realize that there was an extra person in the room. They turned back and recognized Hanjin. Through the clairvoyance released by the Magus, he already knew who killed Zoloff. He couldn't help but scream, kill him for me. The two guards pulled out their long swords and rushed towards Hanjin. At this time, the door suddenly exploded, and Guevara, who looked like a god of war, appeared. The dragon spear in his hand pierced and pushed, and the two guards were crushed by Guevara's tyrannical combat energy. They turned into countless drops of blood that splattered in all directions. Wayne and the silver-haired girl were also splashed with blood. Behind Guevara, Jedis also walked in. Hanjin had already used his telepathic thoughts to lower the god of war to the ground. The mission of the strong people on the ship was to join the battle and take most of the pressure from Riptide to minimize the casualties. However, Guevara and the others were not in the mood to fight. They had seen the extreme beauty and terrifying power of magic. They just wanted to see Hanjin. As for what they wanted to say, they didn't know. Why are you guys here? Hanjin was slightly surprised. I remember that you didn't like to drink much. Guevara's gaze fell on the jug of wine in Hanjin's hand. I'm a little tired. Hanjin smiled and sat back on the chair. You. Guevara paused and said slowly, Raphael, you did well. Really well. Hanjin's gaze became unfocused. He knew very well that Guevara's will was not only referring to his killing of Zoloff, but also his improvement, his living up to expectations, and many other things. However, Hanjin was not a pretentious person. He didn't know how to respond to Guevara's praise, so he could only smile slightly. Major Domo Gale walked in through the broken door. Jedi smiled and said, Found it. Major Domo Gale's old face was slightly red. He didn't know whether to nod or shake his head. In the end, he glared at Jedis. This was the tragedy of a thief. He had thrown his dagger to attack Zoloff, but Zoloff had used his teleportation skill to dodge the attack. As a result, his dagger had flown far away. When the god of war landed, the first thing he did was to look for his dagger. That was his lifeblood. He could not lose it. Otherwise, he would have rushed over with Guevara, Jedis, and the others. Lord Wayne curled up at the foot of the bed, trembling as he looked at the people in the room. The silver-haired girl also looked nervous. Hanjin was calm and did not pose any threat to her. Guevara, on the other hand, had an imposing aura and the dazzling light of his fighting strength when he had barged and had proven his identity. Jedis, Majordomo Gale, and Guevara had an easygoing attitude. It was obvious that they were friends of similar status, and their strength should not be too far apart. The sudden appearance of 3 superior-grade powerhouses would make anyone nervous. Don't come over. Lord Wayne suddenly pulled out his long sword and placed it on the silver-haired girl's neck. He screamed hysterically, If you come over, I will kill her. No one paid attention to him. It was too ridiculous to threaten a hostage in front of a Dragon Knight, a top-class thief, and an archbishop. Moreover, the effect of a hostage was too weak. If it was Sunir, they would have paid more attention. The girl's pupils suddenly turned silver, and 2 lightning bolts shot out from her pupils, hitting City Lord Wayne's chin. In an instant, City Lord Wayne's head was blasted apart by the lightning bolts. Thunder Titan, Guevara was stunned and showed a dignified expression. His eyes swept across the girl's body and finally fell on the black crystal thread on her wrists. Hanjin put down the wine jug and slowly walked over. He gently stroked the black crystal thread and smiled. Do you feel like you're seeing an old friend? Old friend? Yes, she is indeed an old friend. Guevara's eyes flashed fiercely. Jedis and Majordomo Gale looked at each other and did not say anything. After living for so long and experiencing so much, they were not warm-hearted people. Seeing someone in pain, they would rush to help and care about their well-being. This was something that only young people would do. Moreover, the person who was tied up was a Thunder Titan. It said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This saying was too absolute. I was too tired yesterday and made another technical error. This time, it wasn't that I set the wrong time for the update, but that I didn't set it at all. I closed the author section right after I posted it and went to bed. Sorry. Chapter 282. The silver-haired girl struggled a little, tried to avoid Hanjin's fingertips, but the black crystal thread bound her tightly, and she couldn't move at all. At this time, Yelena rushed in from the outside and shouted, "Raphael, I forgot to tell you. You killed that abyss demon. Didn't you find anything?" "You mean this?" Hanjin smiled and took out a magic crystal from his space ring. Yelena's eyes widened, and she nodded in surprise and joy. Yes. This is a space magic crystal, right?" Hanjin handed the magic crystal over. Yes. Yelena took the magic crystal and looked at it fondly in her palm. There are very few space magic beasts on the continent. We've been in the Tereshao Mountains for so long, but we haven't even seen a single space magic beast. This is why space rings are so precious. We should be able to use this space magic crystal to build a magic teleportation array, Guevara said. He was a soldier, so of course he had to consider things from a strategic perspective. No, that would be too wasteful, Yelena and Jedis said at the same time. Then what do you want to do? Guevara frowned. Yelena glanced at Jedis, and seeing that he didn't want to speak, she explained, "If we want to build a magic teleportation array, we could buy a few magic crystals from the cub tiger, or let Raphael go to the forest of magic beasts. Didn't he say that we should do it ourselves?" For ordinary mercenaries, the cub tiger's teleportation and mental attack are very scary. But our Lord Raphael can even defeat a demon, so why would he be afraid of cub tiger? It's not that easy to encounter a cub tiger, unless we break into Paradise Lost. Major Domo Gale interrupted. At this time, Raphael doesn't have time to run around. Guevara directly rejected Yelena's suggestion. But what do you want to do with this magic crystal? I haven't thought about it yet. Yelena couldn't help but think hard. Since you haven't thought about it, then give it back to me first. Hanjin reached out to grab the magic crystal. Yelena was shocked, and her fingers suddenly clenched. Then she hid the magic crystal behind her back. "What are you doing?" She looked nervous, as if she had encountered a robber. Hanjin was a little worried, and said in a negotiating tone, "That magic crystal seems to be my trophy, right?" It was undeniable that Yelena was a reasonable girl, which was why she was in so much pain. She was unwilling to return the magic crystal to Hanjin and was determined not to do so. She was not qualified to act coquettishly. Yelena's face was full of struggle. She mumbled and didn't say whether she would return it or not. Yelena's eyes lit. Yelena's light, tattoo. His words woke her up, and Yelena's eyes suddenly lit up. If she could see more novel and strange magic, she wouldn't hesitate to give up all her treasures, let alone return the magic crystal to Hanjin. "Well, I have an idea, but, in your words, I still need some medium." Hanjin nodded. "Don't worry, I'll find it sooner or later. Here." Yelena handed the magic crystal back, but her eyes were blinking, as if she was telling Hanjin, "When you find the medium and prepare to release new magic, don't forget about me." Hanjin took the magic crystal with a smile. His eyes suddenly fell on the silver-haired girl's face, and he whispered, "Do you know me?" When Guevara praised him and called out his name, the silver-haired girl's expression was a little strange. If it was before, Hanjin wouldn't care about this, but it was different now. "Lord Raphael, a powerful dragon slayer. Of course I've heard of you," the silver-haired girl said slowly. "You are indeed qualified to kill Salav. You're good at flattering." Hanjin smiled. "Thunder Titan? You're from Chisam's tribe? You heard about me from Chesam, didn't you?" "Yes," the silver-haired girl replied. "By the way, I have to tell you that your actions have hurt Chisam's pride. Chesam has already sworn that he will make you suffer the harshest punishment possible." "What a stubborn guy." Hanjin smiled. "In my opinion, he's the one who should be punished because his hands have stretched too far." Han Jin's mentality had undergone a huge change. Back when he and Sunir killed those vampires, they were chased by a large group of vampires. He had always regretted that he didn't cause trouble. But for the current Han Jin, it didn't matter if he killed Solov or provoked him. So what? That was why his words were so sharp, and there was even a hint of mockery in them. He didn't take Chesam seriously at all. The silver-haired girl fell into silence. Han Jin and the others were standing there leisurely, but she was humiliated and tied to the bed. Solov also tore off a part of her dress. Although she wasn't exposed, it still made her feel very uncomfortable. It was very unfair to talk in such an environment. However, the silver-haired girl didn't ask Han Jin to do anything for her. One side was strong, and the other was weak. The stronger side never had to take the initiative to express their opinions. They were only responsible for making the decision. Statements, explanations, and begging usually belonged to the weaker side. After the weaker side finished speaking and begging, they would wait for the stronger side to make the decision. Chesam isn't just stubborn. He's also shameless and cruel. You could even say that he's a madman. The silver-haired girl said slowly. I've heard similar comments. Han Jin nodded. Can you explain why you're here? Guevara interrupted. I'm Chesam's envoy. I'm here to negotiate with Zagund. Guevara was stunned for a moment, then smiled. So, Zagund doesn't want to work with Chesam? On the contrary, Zagund has already reached an agreement with Chesam. I don't understand. Guevara's eyes flashed. How did you kill me? That's Chesam's first condition. When she first heard this news, she didn't believe it at all. However, when Solov left, she thought about it repeatedly. Solov had no reason to lie to her. Oh, why? Because I'm the youngest Thunder Titan in the tribe. Understood. Guevara sighed softly. People like Guevara and Jedis were all smart people. There was no need to explain everything thoroughly. Just a little reminder was all it took for them to understand the cause and effect of the situation. Zagund is getting more and more stupid. Guevara shook his head and said in a worried tone, Work with Chesam? I admire his courage. Chesam has the support of the Titans. What does he have? He really let Chesam in. Does he think that he'll be fine hiding in the buried city? Ha! So you don't know Zagund's strength, the silver-haired girl said softly. I don't know. Guevara laughed loudly. I've been entangled with him since 20 years ago. Today we're friends. Tomorrow we're enemies. How could I not know his strength? That was in the past. The silver-haired girl looked very calm. She had found something that could fully express her goodwill. These people in front of her really didn't know Zagund. Tell me, what do I not know? Guevara's tone had a hint of mockery. Everyone had their weaknesses. Because of his hatred, he couldn't listen to anything that praised Zagund. Therefore, he seemed to be taking advantage of his seniority. I have to warn you seriously. If you kill Solov, you will definitely suffer crazy revenge. Zagund, Han Jin interrupted. He noticed that Guevara was losing control of his emotions. He wanted to say something to calm Guevara down. No, it's the Abyss Demons. Have you heard of the 7 exiled Whip Brothers? Han Jin and the others looked at each other and shook their heads. Knight Guevara, you used to deal with the Abyss Demons. Haven't you heard of the 7 Whip Brothers? The silver-haired girl repeated in surprise. No, you've heard of them before? The silver-haired girl's face turned red because she had never heard of them before. They were exiled by the Abyss Demons. There were 7 of them. Others called them the 7 Whip Brothers. You mean 7 Abyss Demons? Major Domo Gale cried out. Yes, Lord Raphael. The one you killed was called Solov. He was the youngest one among them. The room was silent. Even the air seemed to have become stagnant and heavy. One Abyss Demon was enough to cause a headache. If 7 Abyss Demons came to cause trouble, it would be a devastating disaster. Although they had already killed one, it didn't make much of a difference whether there were 7 or 6 of them. If you think Zagund's strength is still not enough, I can tell you that Alquit has led a large number of vampires to the surface. Alquit, the ancestor of the blood race, Alquit? Guevara's hands suddenly clenched into fists. There were many things about the Abyss Demons. Guevara could not know everything, but he knew about the ancestor of the blood race, Alquit. Yes, the silver-haired girl said. Do you still think that Zagund is not enough to fight against Chesam? Guevara's face became very serious. This had nothing to do with losing face. It was because the threat they were about to face was too great to bear. If Zagund had such strength, he would have attacked Black Raven City long ago, Han Jin said calmly. Because the silver-haired girl frowned and thought hard. After a while, she said in a hesitant tone, I feel that something happened in his underground city. That's why he can't leave. Also, those abyss demons should have been recruited by him recently. Abyss demons are very arrogant. Looking at how Zagund scolded those soldiers, he should not be a casual person. Han Jin suddenly bent down and touched the black crystal threads, trying to find a way to free himself. That was enough. Even if the Thunder Titan regained his freedom and became their enemy, Han Jin would not regret it. The information that the Thunder Titan had revealed had saved countless lives, including Han Jin himself. If he had piloted the god of war and rashly led an army to attack the underground city, what would have happened to him? Chapter 283. In fact, there was no absolute darkness in the world. The distant abyss was different from what ordinary people thought. Even the blind cavemen sometimes needed the warmth of fire. The underground city, which had been abandoned for many years and for unknown reasons, finally regained its former majesty in the hands of Zagund. Looking from afar, the architectural style of the underground city was not much different from the buildings on the ground. However, it was different from the big cities, such as the Holy Crown City and the Capital of Elements. It was more like a huge, ancient castle. In the center of the castle, there were dozens of tall buildings, the tallest of which was almost 100 meters high. What was more amazing was that the abyssal mages used magic to suck out the lava from the lava river. The lava river stretched across the entire castle like a dazzling rainbow. There were 8 similar rainbows in total, flying over the castle from different angles. There were few lights in the castle because they didn't need them. The 8 rainbows were their suns, which could meet their daily needs. Han Jin slowly walked out of a deep tunnel, accompanied by a Medusa. Among the abyssal races, the status of Medusas was neither high nor low. Like elves, they were born to be excellent archers. However, their overall combat ability was much stronger than elves. Their scales all over their body contained highly toxic poison, and they also had an innate ability, petrification. Of course, the success rate of this innate ability was inversely proportional to the rank of the enemy. If facing a sword saint or grand magus who stood at the top of the pyramid, the success rate of an ordinary Medusa's innate ability was infinitely close to 0. Most Medusas had bad tempers, but the Medusa beside Han Jin was very well behaved. Looking at the majestic underground city in front of them, the Medusa said in a timid voice, Sir, it's right in front of us. I see it. Han Jin nodded. Han Jin walked to the shore, looked down at the lava river, and slashed the Medusa's throat with his palm. The Medusa was in so much pain that snot and tears flowed down her face. She covered her throat with her 6 arms at the same time. Han Jin stretched his hand to the back of the Medusa's neck and gave it a gentle push. The Medusa fell into the lava river involuntarily and silently. The beautiful waves of fire rolled and swallowed the Medusa's body. Han Jin raised his head and quietly looked into the distance, his eyes flickering. He came here to find out what was holding Zagund's attention. If Zagund encountered a powerful opponent from the abyss, he would even help the other party defeat Zagund. Although this was like driving a wolf at the front door and a tiger at the back door, he had to do it. The hatred between him and Zagund was as deep as the sea, and there was no way to deal with him. He could only fight to the death. If he couldn't find a flaw, then he would create as much chaos as possible to delay Zagund's attack and buy time for Zagund. Strictly speaking, he was now a terrorist who had sneaked into the enemy's rear. Han Jin took out a handkerchief and wiped his hands clean because Medusa's body gave him a wet and sticky feeling, which was very uncomfortable. Then, he threw the handkerchief into the lava river, shrunk his body, and disappeared without a trace in an instant. A moment later, Han Jin's figure rose from a room in the underground city. He subconsciously looked around. It was a very ordinary room. The curtains were not drawn, and a dim yellow light shone in, softly spreading on the floor. There were a few piles of clothes on the floor, some for men, some for women. There was a large wardrobe at the foot of the wall in front of him, with a tall mirror mounted on top. On the other side were 2 armchairs, and there was a clothes rack near the door. Almost all of the women's clothes were hung on it, and there were some other furnishings. The whole room was full of makeup, like a boudoir. Inside was the bedroom. Han Jin could clearly hear almost hysterical moans, mixed with occasional pleas for mercy. The banging of the bedboard was heavier and louder, indicating that the male partner in the bedroom was quite capable. Han Jin grabbed the black robe on the floor and gently walked to the wardrobe. He measured it, and it was about the same size as him. He was lucky, otherwise he would have to go to a few more places. Han Jin took off his robe, put it into the space ring, and put the black robe on. No matter what race the owner of the robe belonged to, it should be a person who paid attention to personal hygiene. There was no smell on the robe. On the contrary, there was a faint, comfortable fragrance, as if it was sprayed with some kind of perfume. Han Jin dressed properly and looked at himself in the mirror for a while. After confirming that there was nothing wrong with him, he slowly walked to the door, pushed it open, and walked out. Who knew that just as he stepped into the yard, he would bump into an angry minotaur? The minotaur was stunned and then roared, "Kill him!" Immediately after, a few more minotaurs rushed into the yard. Han Jin cursed his bad luck and quickly retreated into the room. He was not afraid of the minotaurs, but before he understood the situation, he did not want to cause trouble. Han Jin strode to the window and pushed it open. At this time, the sounds coming from the bedroom had turned into screams, and there were also the low growls of male creatures. Clearly, the 2 partners inside had entered the best state. Han Jin grabbed a vase and threw it at the bedroom door. With a boom, the vase shattered, and a large hole was smashed in the door. The sounds inside stopped abruptly. Han Jin jumped out of the window, and with a flick of his finger, he floated up and landed on the roof. He then sat down and observed his surroundings. The next moment, a naked human man jumped out of the window and sprinted forward. However, he had only taken a few steps when a shiny giant axe flew out with a whistling sound and struck the human man on the back. Blood splattered, and the human man was almost split in 2 by the giant axe on the spot, falling head first into the alley. Immediately after, the Minotaur's roar came from the room. "You dare betray me! You dare betray me!" And the other human? Where is he? I don't know. I don't know. The woman's voice was filled with fear and panic, but her answer was suddenly cut off by a dull thud. Could one casually harm other life forms here? Han Jin muttered to himself. From the corner of his eye, he saw a Minotaur jump out of the window to pick up his axe. He began to move to the side and landed on the street. The streets of the underground city were very clean. Clearly, Zagund had spent a lot of effort in this aspect. After walking for about 500 to 600 meters, he gradually approached the center of the castle, and the number of people gradually increased. Han Jin learned from Medusa that there were many humans living in the underground city. They were willing to abandon the light and fall into the abyss. As for the reason, Han Jin did not know. The shops on both sides of the road were sparse, and most of them were bars. Alcohol was a universal concept. It seemed that there was no race that didn't like alcohol, but some liked it light, and some liked it as strong as possible. After walking for a long time, Han Jin only saw a few weapon shops and clothing shops. The rest were mostly bars. This kind of development gave people a strange feeling. However, Zagund relied on the Abyss race to build his empire, which was a kind of abnormality in itself. He could not obtain the true love of his subordinates, nor could he fully trust anyone. Further ahead was the center of the castle. There was a huge magic shield there, and he could not see what was inside. At the end of the street, there was a large group of Minotaurs guarding it. It was not suitable to continue forward. Han Jin looked around and turned into a weapon shop. There were a few dwarves busy in the weapon shop. Seeing that it was a dwarf, Han Jin could not help but frown. When he first came to this world, he met a dwarf who was pestering him endlessly, so his impression of dwarves was very bad. Although Sunir later told him about the various advantages of dwarves, such as hardworking, honest, and so on, Han Jin still hated dwarves. It could only be said that the first impression was really too important. The dwarves acted as if they did not see Han Jin and continued to busy themselves. They left Han Jin alone and did not have any manners to welcome customers. Han Jin was a little bored. He really wanted to call a dwarf, point at his nose, and tell him that the customer was their god of light. But then he thought better of it. Dwarves might not believe in the god of light. How much is this sword? Han Jin pointed at a sword hanging on the wall. A dwarf walked over and nimbly climbed onto the table, took off the sword, and threw it in front of Han Jin. 2 gold coins. Han Jin was too lazy to haggle. He took out 2 gold coins and threw them on the table, then put the sword into a space ring. Seeing that Han Jin was very straightforward and had a space ring, the dwarf said lazily, "What else do you want to buy?" If they were like this even when receiving customers, it was hard to imagine that he could get any valuable information out of them. Han Jin shook his head and turned to leave the weapon shop. Just as he stepped out of the weapon shop, a group of people walked into the bar next door, chatting and laughing. Han Jin's gaze suddenly froze, then turned away as if nothing had happened. He actually saw Eva, Mantico's sister, the one who injured Hallister and ran away, the one who had disappeared without a trace. Han Jin hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked into an alley. A moment later, he walked out of the alley with a completely different face. Han Jin covered his forehead with his cloak and slowly walked into the bar. A strange wave of air hit him in the face. Han Jin didn't dislike this kind of place, and he didn't want to interfere with people like Morrison's and Sasu going to a bar for fun. The ancient sage had said it well. Food, men, and women were all human desires. The problem was that the atmosphere in this bar was too obscene. There were dozens of almost naked bar girls walking back and forth in the bar, like a forest of moving flesh. Why would Eva, a great magician, come to a place like this? Han Jin was very confused. He looked around and didn't see Eva. He sat down at an empty table and thought to himself. Chapter 284. Lord Zagund, if you really want to turn them into your fallen angels, I suggest that you don't push them too hard. Behind Zaganide, a tall and sturdy man who was about 3 meters tall slowly said. His appearance was very ferocious, but his manner of speech was very polite, which gave people a strong feeling of contrast. Will, you can't understand my feelings. Zagund took a deep breath. I've wasted too much time on them. You just said it. The burly man named Will answered, while looking at the deep plain with a playful look. I have to remind you that these stubborn guys have their own natural instincts, and it won't do anyone any good to push them too hard. Sacrifice. Beside Will, an ugly man of the same height said coldly. Yes. Will narrowed his eyes. Lord Zagund, no one knows those guys better than us. They are not ordinary angels, but high-grade battle angels. If you really force them to sacrifice, please believe me, you don't want to see that kind of scene. Zagund was silent for a long time, and slowly said so. I have to continue to endure. You've endured for a year. What do you care about these few days? Will laughed. I'm curious. What are you worried about? Raphael from the isolated cliff city? Or Dismark from the Holy Crown City? Ha! My lord, with us here, they're just a bunch of little worms to you. Or you're worried about that hypocritical Mr. Alquite? Will glanced at Lindsay with a malicious look and quickly turned back to Zagund. Lindsay was shocked and scared. When talking about the distant ancestor of the blood race, Alquite's tone was very unfriendly. At this moment, she should have stepped forward and angrily rebuked that big demon, but she didn't have the courage. She could only hold Zagund's arm with her slightly trembling hand, trying to find support from Zagund. You're right. Zagund sighed. I've already endured for a year. There's no need to care about these few days. Your wisdom is enough to illuminate this dark world. Whip bowed slightly. I'm going back to the castle to rest for a day. Zagun said in a soft voice. Well, I'll leave this place to you. I'm at your service. Whip replied respectfully. Zagun nodded and slowly walked to the back. Lindsay, of course, did not have the courage to stay here alone. She hurriedly caught up with Zagund. As Zagund walked further away, the flourishing plants also stopped growing. One by one, they fell to the ground, as if they had entered dreamland. Zaganide didn't know how far he had walked, but he suddenly steadied himself. He turned his head to look back, and a sad look appeared on his face. He heaved a long sigh, and then couldn't help but laugh. My lord, what made you so sad? Lindsay hurriedly asked. Small people also had their own way of living. Although Lindsay wasn't very smart, she was clear about her own disadvantages. In terms of looks, she couldn't compare to the two former matriarchs. She also didn't possess powerful strength or an illustrious background. Within the vampire race, she didn't have any prestige. Everything she had was bestowed upon her by Zagund. Therefore, she had long since made her choice. In this life, she would become Zagund's most intimate echo. When Zagund was in pain and worry, she would use her gentleness to resolve Zagund's troubles. When Zagund was excited and happy, she would use her childishness to highlight Zagund's sense of accomplishment. She wasn't smart, but she was rational. When I was very young, I swore that I would become a supreme lord. Zagund smiled as he walked. Now that I've done it, I suddenly realized that I'm just as lonely as when I was young. Ha! I don't know how many people hate me and view me as an enemy. I often can't tell whether the world has abandoned me or I've abandoned the world. No, my lord, no one can deprive me of my loyalty to you. Even Ancestor Alquite can't, Lindsay said in a panicked tone. No matter what happens in the future, you have me. Forever. All right, Zagund patted Lindsay's shoulder with a smile and continued walking. Lindsay still wanted to say something, but she knew when to stop. She followed behind Zagund, hesitated for a moment, and whispered, You laughed just now. What were you laughing about? In front of Zagund, she was willing to play the role of a childish child, because the more childish she was, the greater and more mature Zagund would be. Do you know what the stupidest person is like? Zagund said slowly. What is it like? He thinks he's infallible. He thinks he's the smartest person in the world. The smile in Zaganide's eyes gradually disappeared and was replaced by a sharp, murderous look. He doesn't know that his success is only due to luck. Ha! Because he was born an abyss demon, he didn't have to walk much and avoided many hardships. Banished? Oof. That just proves his stupidity and arrogance. As for me, I walk step by step from an ordinary human to where I am today, and he wants to toy with me. Zagund's tone became colder and colder. You mean, Lord Wep? Lindsay couldn't wrap her head around it. Zagund had a good relationship with Wep and his brothers, and Zagund had always used them to suppress the vampire Ancestor Alquite. She never would have thought that Zagund would want to kill the demon Wep. Who else could it be? Zagund suddenly stopped at the top of the mountain, turned around, and looked down at the deep plains. I don't understand. Lindsay timidly looked at Zagund. In fact, she wasn't interested in this secret. She only asked according to her own principles in order to highlight Zagund's greatness. As long as Zagund's expression was slightly off, she would immediately shut her mouth. The sacrifice of a high-rank war angel. It's too terrifying. I'm really scared. Zagund sneered. He's not the only one who understands angels. Lindsay, haven't you noticed? In the past, the 6 sealed high-rank war angels used the power of the hexagram array to fight against us. But in the past half a month, they've released the call of light 4 times. Do you know what this means? What? Lindsay asked blankly. Because their power has been exhausted. Not to mention sacrifice. I doubt they can release the call of light again. Zagund sneered. Of course, I'm only suspecting. But Wep was in such a hurry to stop me. Hee, and when I left, his eyes were filled with uncontrollable excitement. The answer is obvious. Why would they deceive you? Of course they have their own reasons. I'm not friends with them, otherwise I would have reminded them. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. Zagun's expression became cheerful again. Let's go. Come with me to find your ancestor, Alquit. I think he'll be interested. Yes, Lindsay replied respectfully. It should be night on the surface now. Zagun said slowly. Tonight is destined to be a night of bloodshed. Not long after Zagun left, the demon brothers who should have been stationed on the surface appeared beside Wep one after another. 6 tall figures stood in a row. No one spoke, only quietly looking ahead. After a long while, the last abyssal demon on the right finally couldn't help but ask, Boss, are we really going to make a move today? Should we wait a few more days? Boss, Lambert's words make sense. Another abyssal demon said. Those guys are high-rank war angels after all. If we wait a few more days, we'll be more confident. Lambert, Kiki, it seems your courage has been tempered in the years of wandering. Wep, who was in the middle, slowly shook his head. I can't think of anything. What are you afraid of? This is the Abyss world. The power of angels can't be replenished here. They've already fought against Zagun for a year. How much power do you think they have left? Cough. The demon called Lambert seemed a little embarrassed. He then tried to explain, Boss, don't forget. They're using the power of the hexagram array to fight against Zagun. Their consumption seems to be... Do you remember what it was like 4 months ago when we first came here? I remember. Lambert nodded. The light of the hexagram array enveloped the entire plains. That kind of light was very detestable. And now, Lambert opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. They're cherishing every bit of their power because they've already fallen into a desperate situation. Lambert, we've already gained the upper hand. Do you still feel fear? Boss, if only Salav was here. The abyssal demon, called Kiki, hurriedly tried to smooth things over. Ha! The little baby who used to cry so easily has now become a strong demon. Salav, Wep frowned. It's our fault. We've spoiled him. Do you know why I told him to go to Fort Maxine? If he knows about our plan, he'll definitely lose his cool. If Zagun finds out. So what if he finds out? Kiki sneered. At worst, we'll kill him too. There's a saying that goes, fearless. Wep's eyes flashed. Since Zagun dares to cooperate with us, he should at least have the ability to protect himself. Kiki, you're using your courage in the wrong place. The angels are our mortal enemies. Kiki lowered his head, fiddling with his scythe uneasily. Don't talk nonsense. Listen to boss. The silent demon standing beside Wep suddenly said coldly. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 285. Finally, the once hesitant and restless hands firmly held onto the scythe. The experience of these years told them that they must be tightly united. Strictly speaking, their strength had deteriorated very seriously. They only had one left hand left, and they could no longer wield the scythe as smoothly as before. Originally, the attack power of the demons was not strong, and now it was even worse. If the brothers went their separate ways, they would soon disappear in the dust of history. Let's begin, Wei Pu said with an aria-like voice, and then he took big strides and slowly walked forward. The other brothers followed beside Wei Pu, and the 6 huge men lined up in a row, advancing into the depths of the plains. The so-called brothers in war, father and son soldiers in battle. No matter whether they wanted to fight or not, since they had already decided to fight, then none of them would shrink back. Wei Pu's left hand tightly gripped the giant scythe and swung it forward. The figures of the 6 evil demons suddenly disappeared, and in the next moment, they had already approached the hexagram array. The giant scythes were like streaks of black lightning, silently cutting down. Wei Pu and the other brothers were just right to fight against the 6 angels guarding the hexagram array. The problem was, no one would be so stupid to give up the advantage. Abyss magic had always been good at wolf pack tactics, gathering the power of many to attack the enemy. At this moment, they still maintained their usual style. The angel who was attacked calmly raised his light sword, and the star point below him suddenly lit up. Abyss demons were indeed a headache, but the angels of the heaven realm were also the same. Among all the super-ranked creatures, only the angels never knew what fear was. When they fought, they would go all out, and there was no retreat. Even if they were facing a god's residence, they would not hesitate to wave the light sword in their hands. It was called a strategic shift, and it would never have anything to do with the angels. If an angel knew fear, knew how to choose, or learned to think, knew how to cherish himself, he would often turn into a fallen angel. Perhaps they could not be said to be pure, but they were definitely pure creatures. Complicating their nature was a kind of betrayal in itself. The angel waved his light sword horizontally, blocking the two giant sides that were chopping down from the sky, but he turned a blind eye to the four giant sides below. He only had one sword, so he could not block all the attacks. However, the fluttering light wings suddenly turned into countless straight light arrows, like raindrops, attacking the abyss demons surrounding him. When the giant size caused damage to him, the attacks he released would also penetrate the bodies of the abyss demons. Wei Pu's figure suddenly disappeared, and then appeared beside another angel. The giant scythe in his hand was chopping towards the angel's neck. Wei Pu's brothers also teleported, and immediately launched an attack. The angel chanted something in a low voice, and a circular light screen appeared out of thin air. At the same time, it blocked the giant scythes. The light sword in his hand was also swung out. The sword's momentum was majestic, and it carried the power of 1,000 caddies as it chopped towards Wei Pu's head. Wei Pu sneered, and his figure disappeared again. In the distance, Han Jin quietly stood there, observing the battle in the distance. The attacks launched by the abyss demons were like a raging tide, wave after wave, but they did not seem to have any order in their choice of target. One moment they would attack this, the next moment they would attack that, and in a short moment, they had exchanged blows with the 6 angels. The hexagram array was like a huge neon light. Following the attacks of the abyss demons, one star after another blossomed with a soft light, and then when the abyss demons gave up, it returned to darkness. Han Jin could see that the abyss demons were not using their full strength. They seemed to be waiting for something, looking for something, and the angels guarding the hexagram array did not show any signs of defeat, calmly resisting the attacks of the abyss demons. He naturally had to help the angels, but he couldn't act rashly. The innate talent of the abyss demons was a headache, so he had to grasp the perfect opportunity. It was fine if he didn't make a move, but when he did, he had to see the results. After an unknown amount of time, Han Jin suddenly woke up and his figure shrank down, instantly disappearing without a trace. On the entire plain, the countless plants that seemed to have entered dreamland slowly woke up, but their movements were not as arrogant as before. The plants closer to the hexagram array remained motionless, while the plants in the distance were quietly growing. The countless roots of the forest became thicker and thicker, even reaching a few meters. The ends of the branches and leaves had already reached the ground, taking root and sprouting, continuing to grow. Finally, the branches and leaves formed a huge net that covered the sky, slowly squeezing towards the center of the plain from all directions. The battle near the hexagram array became more and more intense. The abyss demons were constantly attacking, and the angels guarding the hexagram array were fully focused on defending, so no one noticed the changes in the distance. The abyss demons and the heavenly angels were mortal enemies. The giant scythes in the hands of the abyss demons were made from their own bones, using a method unknown to the outside world. Even if it was just a light hit, the giant scythes could cause great damage to the angels. Similarly, the attacks of the angels could also cause great damage to the abyss demons. Although the two sides did not use their full strength, every battle put them in a situation where life and death were hanging by a thread. If there was a slight difference, there would be no turning back. Although this kind of battle was very dangerous, it was more or less boring. The abyss demons always left as soon as they touched, not giving the enemy a chance and not giving themselves a chance. Under the cover of the rhizome forest, a group of figures slowly approached the center of the plain. However, they stopped 1,000 meters away and waited quietly. The six giant sighs once again cut down. The angel who was attacked held his sword with both hands, and his pair of light wings suddenly shrunk into a ball. Then, with a bang, the light wings exploded in all directions, and countless light waves swept out with an unstoppable force. The abyssal demons, led by Will, released their teleportation and left the battlefield. The angel folded her wings of light and slowly lowered her head. But in that moment, Will and the other 5 abyssals appeared in front of the angel once more. 6 giant sighs howled through the air. Compared to the previous attack, the speed of the sighs was twice as fast, and the threat they posed to the angel was dozens of times greater. When the several abyssals appeared, the sides had already approached the angel's body. In a battle between powerhouses, the slightest mistake could lead to a difference of 1,000 miles. Thousands of teleportations. Will was not only looking for an opportunity, but also to numb the opponent's reaction and create the opportunity now. The angel was already used to the demons, constantly changing targets. Suddenly seeing the demons attack him again, the angel paused, and his huge figure suddenly emitted a dazzling light. However, his movements were still a bit slow, and the 6 sides chopped at his body at almost the same time. Will revealed a cold smile. Running away after one attack. This was the fighting style of the demons that would never change. Unfortunately, they were not the only ones waiting for an opportunity. 1,000 meters away, an elder with a kind face stretched out his arms towards the sky. Will's smile suddenly froze on his face. Their figures had already become blurry, but they were unable to teleport. An incomparably huge spiritual force was forcefully interfering with their innate talent. The other 5 angels simultaneously launched a counterattack. Their figures had to stay at their star fate points, and their light swords were unable to reach far. However, their fluttering light wings could extend to several hundred meters away. In just an instant, the spatial barrier formed by spiritual force disappeared, and the light rain covered the figures of Will and his brothers. Although the teleportation was successful, it left behind a mournful scream. In the next instant, Will and his brothers appeared a few dozen meters away. Only now did they discover the abnormality in the distance. Whether it was the attacker, the counterattack, or the person who suddenly launched the attack, everyone's eyes were focused on that angel. Even Will, whose eyes were about to split open, forgot to angrily shout at someone. The angel fell down bit by bit and finally knelt on the ground with one knee. His hands supported his light sword, and a faint singing voice resounded between heaven and earth. That singing voice contained sorrow, compassion, and a silence that came from the depths of the soul. It clearly could not be heard clearly, but made people feel an indescribable pressure. The angel's wings of light slowly turned into drifting specks of light, disappearing into the air piece by piece. When the dancing wings of light peeled off and disappeared, the angel's body also began to turn into fragments, faster and faster. A moment later, the angel had completely disappeared, leaving not a single trace behind. Zagun's face revealed an expression of ecstasy. Sure enough, angels simply did not have the strength to sacrifice themselves. Will's face was filled with remorse. If he knew that those high-level battle angels were already weakened to this extent, he would have already attacked with all his strength. Our strength has already been exhausted, and now we have lost a comrade. An angel's voice was really pure. He actually showed his weakness to the enemy without holding back. No one could tell whether they were wise or foolish. The hexagram array has already lost all meaning. Another angel said in a clear voice. He was as pure as his comrade. Then, an angel let out a long sigh. Shatter. An angel slowly raised his light sword. Will suddenly thought of something, and his face revealed a look of fear. He was different from those silly angels. He knew fear because he was afraid of death and didn't want to die. It was also because of this that he lost his opportunity. Originally, he could have finished the battle before Zagun came back. Those high-level battle angels looked insufferably powerful on the surface, but in reality, they were already extremely weak. Alquit, Zagund, I definitely won't let you off. Wei Pu roared angrily and turned around to rush out of the plains. The clumps and clusters of malevolent plants blocked their path, and they were unable to use instant transmission. They could only rely on their strength to force their way out. Zagund didn't seem to hear anything. His gaze was still fixed on those few angels, and Alquit's eyes revealed a look of pain. However, the hundreds of vampires standing behind him were in much more pain than him. Some of them even tore their hair with all their might and let out mournful howls. Today's update was delayed purely because of personal matters. I apologize to everyone. I'm really sorry. As for what happened, I won't say it here. Seeing that many readers are disgusted with writers talking about their personal matters, I really had no choice today. Chapter 286. With Will at the lead, the 6 abyssal angels formed a triangular cone, desperately killing their way out of the plains. Over the past few months, they had seen Zagund's style of doing things. He was a guy who either did nothing or did something thoroughly and cleanly. At this moment, Zagund had already extended his vicious hand to them and definitely wouldn't let them leave. Zagund wanted to deal with the battle angels, and this was their only chance. The thick plant forest couldn't resist the abyssal demon's giant scythes. With a light slash of the scythes, the bearing plants were cut down like grass. In a short moment, Will led his brothers into the depths of the plant forest. It seems a bit too easy, a thought arose in Will's mind. As if to prove Will's judgment, the sounds of magic chanting echoed one after another. Several hundred abyssal mages hiding behind the plant path revealed their sinister faces. Magic halos fell from the sky, rose from the ground, and even suddenly appeared beside Will and his brothers. The so-called easy became a thing of the past in the blink of an eye. The weak side of the abyssal demons was undoubtedly highlighted. Their fighting strength was terrifying because they had a special innate ability, teleportation. But the dense plant forest had already filled the surrounding space, and even new plants had grown behind them. With their innate abilities sealed, the abyssal demons could only rely on their giant size and their bodies to resist the magic. In this aspect, they were far inferior to other super-rank life forms. Moreover, Will and his brothers were already seriously injured. The attack just now seemed so sharp, but it was only a matter of desperation and madness. Zagund's expression was tense and anxious, his gaze firmly fixed on the few battle angels. He simply didn't have the time to take care of Will and his brothers. Alquit was the same. His lips were slightly opened, as if he was reciting something. The abyssal demons were a powerful, super-rank race, but now they were actually being ignored. This was more or less a tragedy. At this moment, everyone was struggling, yearning, working hard, and even burning for their own survival, their mission, and their goal. The high-level angels in the hexagram array had already made their final decision. Pure white flames emerged from their bodies and flowed to their feet, gathering in the center of the hexagram array. Zagund had been dealing with the high-level battle angels for an entire year, but he still couldn't figure out what secrets were hidden in the 6-pointed astral array. He only knew that the mission of the 6 high-level battle angels was to protect this 6-pointed astral array, and the 6-pointed astral array was also protecting something. No one would set up a huge hexagram array in the abyss for no reason. When he was very young, Zagund had already understood that everything in the world had its own unique mission, goal, process, and even result. Moreover, several high-grade battle angels didn't hesitate to expend their energy to summon the light when they were on the brink of death. This proved that the hexagram array had existed for a very long time. The gate of heaven had already closed, and the demon pool could no longer feel the power of death god Hamas. It was impossible to summon the angels in his place for support, just like summoning death god Hamas's clone. But the high-level battle angels did not know this. Now, it was finally time for the truth to come to light. Zagund clenched his fists unknowingly. The white flames that gathered together finally penetrated the barrier in the center of the hexagram array, and a bright world appeared in front of them. All kinds of strange flowers grew on the ground with a radius of tens of meters. The colors of the flowers were bright and soft, and there seemed to be a burst of refreshing fragrance in the air. In the midst of the colorful flowers, there was a female angel standing there with her head lowered. The white flames surged toward the female angel. Wherever they passed, all the exotic flowers and plants that were pleasing to the eye were turned into nothingness. The female angel's figure became fainter and fainter. Finally, in a burst of brilliance, it became something like a necklace that floated quietly. Glorious pendant. Zagund made a judgment at the first moment, and he almost cried tears of joy. Although he had guessed that the hexagram array had great significance, he never thought that there would be a divine artifact that had been lost for thousands of years hidden here. Alquit let out a sharp howl. Behind him, the hundreds of vampires who were howling in pain suddenly became quiet. Their heads exploded like watermelons, cracking, shattering, and finally turning into a thick mist of blood. Alquit pointed with his finger, and the blood mist turned into a frenzy, surging in the direction of the hexagram array. The hundreds of headless corpses fell to the ground and turned into white bones. If the few high-ranked battle angels still maintained their peak strength, the magic that Alquit sacrificed hundreds of his people to release would not be effective. The angel's mission was to cleanse evil, and the rich light element would be enough to protect them from harm. However, the angels were already very weak, and they tried to use the last of their strength to destroy the glorious pendant. The blood beads hidden in the mist were extremely heavy and sticky. As long as they stuck to their bodies, they could not get rid of them. What made the angels even more painful was that the blood beads kept seeping into their bodies. In the blink of an eye, the light they emitted was mixed with a bit of blood. Zagund stepped forward and slowly walked toward the hexagram array. When he was about 100 meters away, he reached out his hand and grabbed the glorious pendant from afar. Of course, he could not grab it, and the angels still had some consciousness and were not completely controlled by Alquit. He could not get close for the time being. His action of forgetting was only an expression of his emotions. At this moment, a slender and powerful hand suddenly stretched out from the ground and gently grabbed the glorious pendant. No, no! Zagund's eyes were about to split open, and he let out an angry roar. From the peak of joy, he suddenly fell to the bottom of the valley. He felt a heart-wrenching pain, and he almost could not breathe. Han Jin stood there quietly, looking at the pendant in his hand. For such a long time, he had too many opportunities to make a move. For example, when Will and his brothers were heavily injured by the angels, when Alquit released his magic with all his might, when Zagund was expressing his emotions, but he did not make a move. He had been enduring all this time. The feeling of plucking peaches is indeed delightful. Han Jin smiled silently. Zagund, do you agree with my point of view? Although his tone was a bit frivolous, his expression, his patience, and so on, all proved that he already had the ability to fight against the ambitious and ruthless Zagund, and he even had the upper hand. Raphael. Zagund gritted his teeth and said word by word. He had also received a lot of information about Han Jin. In the entire world, only Han Jin could receive the protection of the earth and roam freely. Alquit's face had already turned green. He roared, and a few blood-stained angels slowly raised their light swords and surrounded Han Jin in the middle. My happiness is always built on top of your pain. Zagund, you are really unfortunate. Han Jin's eyes flashed. He did not get carried away. The reason why he continued to provoke Zagund was to test out Zagund's true strength and prepare for the upcoming battle. Although Han Jin had always been slandering Zagund's strength, nearly 20 years had passed since then. If Zagund could have his current strength and influence in 2 years, it was impossible for Zagund to have not improved at all. Zagund laughed bitterly. His eyes had already turned blood red, and his entire face gradually changed shape. In the end, he turned into a monster with a human body and a wolf's head. Then, in the midst of a mournful howl, the countless plants that covered the mountains and the plains danced wildly and rushed towards Hanjin from all directions. Even new plants grew out from under Hanjin's feet and wrapped around Hanjin's legs. As for Will and his brothers, he could no longer care about them. There was only one thought left in his mind, and that was to kill Hanjin and take back the glorious pendant that should have belonged to him. Evildoer, return my world to peace. Purify. Hanjin chanted an incantation that no one else could understand. With a flip of his wrist, a dazzling light rose from his palm and immediately turned into a pure light wave that rippled in all directions. The plants that Zagun controlled melted like ice and snow meeting boiling water. Moreover, the light wave became brighter and brighter, and its range became wider and wider. The deep plain was as bright as day, and even the blood color emitted by the angels was completely digested. Zagund turned into an afterimage and pounced straight at Hanjin, even faster than a sharp arrow. His swollen and deformed claws, which were almost the size of a shield, went straight for Hanjin's heart. With the hexagram array destroyed, the angels were no longer restrained. At this moment, they had regained their senses, and several light swords spread out in the same direction, blocking Zagund's thunderous attack. With a loud bang, Zagund's figure was sent flying dozens of meters away. He staggered back a dozen steps on the ground before barely stabilizing himself. Thank you, powerful mage. You used pure power to save our depravity. Thank you. An angel spread his gradually dimming light wings to express his gratitude to Hanjin. They had long become extremely weak in the battle, where they could not replenish themselves for many years. They had even tried to use the last of their strength to destroy the glorious pendant, and had been contaminated by the vampires. In the end, they had even blocked Zagund's attack for Hanjin. They could no longer maintain their lives. Before they finished speaking, the figures of the 5 high-level battle angels had turned into drifting light spots one after another. But this time, they did not dissipate in the air. Countless light spots gathered in Hanjin's palm, or rather, gathered in the glorious pendant. Hanjin's pure light spell was a great help to Will and his brothers. The vegetation in the forest withered, and they regained their ability to teleport. In the blink of an eye, giant scythes took the lives of dozens of abyssal mages. Soon after, their figures disappeared into the depths of the plains. Hanjin scanned his surroundings. Countless evil eyes, medusas, minotaurs, and abyssal mages formed an army that surged in his direction. Hanjin shook his head and looked at Zagund with a threatening gaze before his figure shrank down. At the same time that Hanjin disappeared, Zagund had already pounced forward. His thick claws heavily slammed into the ground, causing smoke and dust to rise. Deep cracks with the point of attack as the center wriggled in all directions. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 287. As the saying goes, take his life while he's down. Hanjin walked slowly in the mage tower of the underground city. No matter how tight Zagund control of the mage tower was, it was useless to Hanjin. Outside the mage tower, there were hundreds of minotaurs patrolling back and forth. At the top of the tower, there were a few abyssal mages in charge of guarding. However, Hanjin directly snuck into the mage tower and easily avoided all the checkpoints. If a city was compared to a person, then this place was the heart of the person. In order to deal with Will and his brothers, Zagund had already mobilized most of the abyssal mages and his elite troops. If he didn't cause trouble now, when would he? The facilities in the mage tower were very complete. This was not only the heart of the city's defense system, but also the place where the abyssal mages learned and grew. As he walked down the stairs, he could often see abyssal mages in groups of 2s and 3s discussing, laughing, or walking hurriedly. Hanjin had already made up his mind to attack the moment he was interrogated. Therefore, his expression was very calm, and he even looked at the surrounding scenery with interest as he walked. However, even when he reached the top of the building, the main tower of the Magus Tower was right in front of him. No one came to stop him. Han Jin sensed something and raised his head to look at the sky. Before he entered the underground city, he had already seen a rainbow bridge. Now that he was looking at it from above, he realized how spectacular the rainbow bridge made of lava was. Every lava flow was 7 to 8 meters wide. They rose from one end of the city and descended from the other, spanning the entire sky. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" A gentle voice sounded behind Han Jin. Han Jin looked back. It was a female abyssal mage. She wore a light red silk dress that covered her feet. She had a graceful figure, and a cloak made of unknown magic bee skin was draped over her shoulders. Her skin was very white, and her eyes were picturesque. She looked very pure. "Yes." Han Jin nodded, then asked, "Night elves?" The female abyssal mage also nodded. "Are you new?" "Why do you ask?" "Because only new mages would stand here to admire the rainbow bridge. We have already seen too much." The female abyssal mage sized up Han Jin. "Human? I'm Joyce. Nice to meet you. My name is Raphael." Han Jin smiled. Han Jin's appearance had always made Morrison's, Sasu, and the others jealous. Also, his temperament was elegant, and it was difficult for people to dislike him. For strangers, it was already half the battle if they did not dislike him. At least, they would be interested in talking to him. "Raphael? This name sounds familiar." Joyce frowned and thought for a moment. Then he smiled and said, "I know. I must have heard from a friend." "Hey, you have to be careful. It seems like you've already attracted the interest of others." "Maybe they have the same name," Han Jin said with a smile. "That's impossible." Joyce shook his head. Han Jin lost interest in talking. His purpose here was to kill, not to seek pleasure. He slowly turned around and glanced at the two minotaurs. The two minotaurs were guarding the entrance of the main tower. If he wanted to enter the main tower, he had to force his way through. Under his feet was a familiar rock made by alchemists. Burrowing had lost its effect, and he did not want to get a big bump on his head again. "It seems like you have something on your mind," Joyce said as he moved to the wall and looked at the small crowd below. "Something on my mind? Actually, I know even if you don't say it," Joyce said in a confident tone. "Tell me." Han Jin did not know whether to laugh or cry. "You're a human. You're willing to give up the warmth of the sun and come to the underground city. This already proves everything." Joyce's gaze once again focused on Han Jin, but this time his eyes were full of sympathy. "Forget the suffering of the past. This is the paradise that Lord Zagund created for you, me, and all the unfortunate lives. Believe me, you'll live a good life here. You'll be very happy." Han Jin's experience was already very rich, but he was still stunned by Joyce's encouragement. In fact, this was normal. Zagund used terrifying means to deal with his enemies, but when it came to commanding his own army and managing his own city, he would not use the same terrifying means. Even the wildest and most violent race would sometimes become fragile and need a quiet and safe home. Han Jin was the first to have a conflict with the vampires. Later, he occupied Nuremberg and Black Raven City. Now that he came to the underground city, everything he saw made him dislike Zagund, Zagund's forces, and even the entire abyssal race. Therefore, he thought Joyce's words were ridiculous. "My past was as tragic as yours. I was ostracized and bullied everywhere." Joyce sighed faintly. "Only here did I find my own peace." "How long have you been here?" Han Jin asked with a smile. "More than 10 years. "Why?" "Zagund occupied this underground city for only a year, right? I used to be in Black Raven City, but there was a despicable guy who secretly attacked Black Raven City when Lord Zaganide was away on an expedition." Fortunately, Joyce suddenly couldn't continue. She felt like she had discovered something, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She tilted her head and pondered hard. "Do you believe it?" Han Jin asked with a smile. "Believe what?" "Believe what you said just now. That Zagund created a paradise for you." "Why not? I'm the best proof of that." Joyce realized that Han Jin did not use honorifics to address Zagund. She was really angry, but she could understand Han Jin. Almost everyone who was forced to hide in the abyss had a bitter past, so they were suspicious of everything. So it's true. When a lie is repeated 1,000 times, it becomes the truth. Han Jin could not help but shake his head with a smile. You can't say that. Joyce's expression became serious. I can pretend that I didn't hear anything, but if you say that in front of others, you'll get yourself into big trouble. Talking casually will get you into big trouble. Is this really a paradise? Han Jin laughed. Well, Joyce was speechless. You just came here, so you don't believe anything. You'll get used to it after a while. Feel it with your heart. I can only feel the cries of countless wronged souls. Han Jin lowered his head and looked at his hands. Even he did not know if he was talking about Zagund or himself. Forget it. Let's not talk about this. Joyce forced a smile. She realized that the thoughts of the person in front of her were very strange and sharp. She tried to change the topic. If there's a chance in the future, I'll take you to see my sister. She's very nice. You like her, and you'll believe what I say. Of course, the like that the pair of childish eyes thought of had nothing to do with desire. It was just pure like how she liked Han Jin now. Your sister? Her name is Hazel. Joyce raised her head proudly. Hazel. Han Jin narrowed his eyes. I've seen her before. Really? Joyce's face was filled with surprise and joy. She grabbed Han Jin's arm. You've seen her before? When did you see her? Han Jin's eyes suddenly shot out a sharp light. In the country that he feared the most, he was attacked by a child. If it was not for the faked Earth corpse, he would have been dead already. Therefore, he was very cautious of things that looked weak and childish. When Joyce jumped at him, he almost threw a punch at her innocent face. Han Jin's murderous intent was so strong that Joyce shivered. However, she still grabbed Han Jin's arm and begged. When did you see her? Tell me. Tell me. It's been more than a year. On the surface, Han Jin retracted his murderous intent and said softly, Oh! Joyce pulled her hand back in disappointment. Her face blushed slightly. I'm sorry, I lost my composure. I haven't seen my sister for a long time, so it's nothing. I understand. Han Jin smiled and shook his robe. If you see Hazel again, tell her that someone called Raphael told her that what she did to you was wrong. After that, Han Jin walked slowly toward the main tower. Wrong? What wrong? Joyce stared blankly at Han Jin's back. Also, I'm sorry. Han Jin turned around and smiled at Joyce. Then, he started walking again. The place where they were talking was about 300 meters away from the main tower. After a while, Han Jin was already close to the main tower, leaving Joyce confused. Honorable Magician, your pass. A Minotaur smiled strangely and reached out his hand to Han Jin. In fact, they were not in charge of the Mage Tower. Because the people in the tower were their own people, they were very friendly. Okay. Han Jin flipped his wrist, and a green light suddenly bloomed. Before the Minotaur could react, two huge heads had already soared into the sky, accompanied by a bloody glow. Han Jin opened the door and strode in. Joyce, who was far away, had not yet recovered from the violent and bloody scene. She saw a bright red light shining in the interior of the Mage Tower. Then she saw the tall tower start to collapse in an instant, and it collapsed into powder. Finally, she heard an incomprehensible but loud chant. A stone stirs up 1,000 waves. The 8 majestic rainbow bridges collapsed at the same time. Balls of hot and heavy lava fell. Joyce reflexively cast a magic barrier around himself. However, the people in the underground city were not so lucky. The lava continued to hit the ground and turned into flying streams of fire, setting the houses on fire and melting the lives. In the blink of an eye, the underground city had turned into a purgatory. Chapter 288. Amidst the flying smoke and dust, Han Jin leisurely walked out. A soft green light was hovering above him. Neither the rolling stones nor the scorching lava could affect him in the slightest. Murderer! Joyce screamed, and a large fireball shot out towards Han Jin's body. Han Jin waved his right hand, and the green light flashed, shattering the large fireball into pieces. He then looked at Joyce, shook his head slightly, and slashed his sword across the sky. When the abyssal mages rushed out of the tower, they only saw a stream of light disappearing into the depths of the earth. If you want to play to your heart's content. Seeing this scene, the abyssal mages, including Zagund who hurried back to the underground city, all thought that Hanjin had left and left satisfied. However, at this moment, Hanjin actually appeared on the deep plains again, leaning on a huge rock and looking down lazily. About 30 abyssal mages were busy at the original location of the hexagram array. Although the hexagram array had been destroyed, there were still some mysterious runes left on the ground. Their job was to copy all the runes that they could recognize on paper according to their original arrangement. This job was not to be belittled. Magic was originally the specialty of gods and demons. Every race had a huge treasure trove of knowledge, and most of it was learned and copied using similar methods. There were also many minotaurs cleaning up the corpses of their companions on the plains. Other than the hundreds of sacrifice vampires, the abyssal mages suffered the heaviest casualties. In Zagund's botanical forest boundary, the abyssal mages had beaten the WIP brothers to the point that they couldn't fight back. However, after a few abyssal demons recovered their teleportation ability, they immediately caused great damage to the abyssal mages. Dozens of abyssal mages lost their lives, and this was because the demons were determined to escape. If WIP had wanted to stay and continue fighting, he might have been able to annihilate the entire abyssal mages. An abyssal mage in charge of patrolling just happened to walk to the bottom of the hill and vaguely saw a black shadow on the hill. He blinked and looked carefully, but couldn't see anything. Soon after, he felt wind behind his head, and his body fell to the ground. Hanjin covered himself with a cloak and slowly walked towards the abyssal mages at the original location of the hexagram array. Although most of them had very good night vision, there was no light source on this land. The light of 2 or 3 eternal magic lamps couldn't reach far, so no one noticed anything unusual, and they allowed Hanjin to slowly approach. "Hey, you idiot! You step on a rune." An abyssal mage suddenly roared at Hanjin. Hanjin stopped. The rune mark, which had lost its source of magic, couldn't withstand being stepped on. The rune mark under Hanjin's feet had already turned into a puddle of sand. The abyssal mages carefully from the side and grabbed Hanjin's shoulder. "Get out. You are." Hanjin's fist had already been swung out. It seemed casual, but in fact, it was extremely fast and powerful. The abyssal mage flew back a dozen meters as if he had been hit head-on by a train. He then rolled 7 or 8 times, and by the time he stabilized himself, he had already turned into a puddle of mud. "Careful!" The abyssal mage closest to him sensed that something was wrong, and while warning his companions, he released a spell. The ground trembled slightly, and something like a bamboo shoot suddenly rose from the ground. However, Hanjin had already formed a spell at the same time the magic wave was produced, and his body disappeared on the spot. The next moment, he appeared beside the abyssal mage, and a green light flashed, piercing through the abyssal mage's chest. "Kill him! Enemy! Enemy!" The abyssal mages cried out in alarm, and all of their minds locked onto Hanjin. Magic halos rushed into the sky, illuminating the dark plains. Once again, Hanjin released the earth-shrinking spell and appeared behind an abyssal mage. Wherever the green light passed, the abyssal mage's magic shield was instantly shattered. Then, the abyssal mage's body was cut in half, and blood spurted out like a fountain. Hanjin's shrink spell was comparable to the abyssal demon's teleportation, but there would be a slight pause when he released the spell because he needed time to form a spell. However, his movement speed was faster than the abyssal demons, making up for his shortcomings. Although the abyssal demons could fight for a long time, and he was limited by energy, it was enough to deal with these abyssal mages without the support of a true powerhouse. Every time Hanjin launched an attack, an abyssal mage would fall in a pool of blood. However, in order to deal with the White brothers, Zagund had brought the most elite abyssal mages. Even in a one-sided crisis, they were shocked but not panicked. They desperately locked on Han Jin and released magic while scattering in all directions. Han Jin's lips curled into a cold smile. These abyssal mages were treating him like a demon. Although the abyssal demon's teleportation was strange and unpredictable, the distance they could move was only a few dozen meters. What Han Jin released was a shrink spell, and if he could only maintain a distance of a few dozen meters, it wouldn't be called a shrink spell. With a raise of his hand and a slash of his sword, blood spurted out. With another raise of his hand and a slash of his sword, blood spurted out again. When the abyssal mages pulled away from each other as they wished, more than a dozen of their companions had already been killed by Han Jin. At this moment, they realized in despair that Han Jin could still appear beside them with ease and swat their companions to death like flies. In the distance, Alquite silently looked at the dozen or so vampires kneeling in front of him. They had always been respectful when they followed their ancestors, but at this moment, there was only fear on their faces. "My fallen angel, my fallen angel," Alquite kept muttering to himself. His sharp eyes seemed to have no focus, and his expression was sorrowful and miserable. He didn't feel sorry for the hundreds of vampires who had sacrificed themselves. In fact, to any blood-breed ancestor, their descendants were just tools. In order to strengthen their own strength, there was nothing that they couldn't sacrifice. When Zagund came to him, he almost forgot himself and immediately agreed to cooperate with Zagund. Although he knew that Zagund definitely had some tricks up his sleeve, he was confident in his magic. The power of a vampire came from blood, and the fallen angels born from blood would only listen to his command. There was no way that they would be controlled by Zagund. Alquite was extremely excited at the thought of bringing a few fallen angels back to his home. Unfortunately, all of this was ruined by one person. Ancestor, that guy has appeared again. A vampire flapped his wings and flew over. As soon as he landed on the ground, he let out a panicked cry. "Which guy?" Alquite roared. He had already forgotten his manners and only wanted to find something to vent his anger. "It's that Raphael." That vampire was so scared that his legs went soft, and he knelt on the ground with a thud. Alquite was stunned. His body suddenly rose from the ground and turned into a huge silver bat, shooting in the direction that the vampire had come from. At this moment, the battle on Han Jin's side was nearing its end. Although he already understood that there were ignorant and kind beings like Joyce among the abyssal mages, he didn't hold back at all. Joyce was just a special case that made his heart soften a little. The so-called special case meant that it wouldn't happen again. At least, there wouldn't be a second one in a day. The remaining abyssal mages had all fallen into pools of blood. More than half of the Minotaurs, Evil Eyes, and Medusas had also been killed. Although they still maintained their courage to fight, shouting and rushing over, to Han Jin, they were just a bunch of jokes. "It's time to go." Han Jin looked around, then slowly formed a seal. At this moment, a silver bolt of lightning shot over from afar. It was particularly eye-catching in this dark world. "Alquite?" Han Jin frowned slightly. Then, his eyes became brighter and brighter. He had heard from Guevara that Alquite's strength had reached the peak of the super level a long time ago. All this time, he had been living with his tail between his legs. But now, perhaps because this trip had gone smoothly, he suddenly had the urge to fight Alquite. He wanted to find out his own position, or at least find out the difference between him and a true powerhouse. Crushing one ant after another was not considered brave. Facing Alquite, the ancestor of the blood race, was the real test. In the past, he didn't have the qualifications to take risks. After absorbing Murphy's blood, his strength had increased tremendously. He could finally cast spells systematically, and was no longer the useless person who used to use all his energy in a few moves. Alquite had already approached quickly. He spread his wings and turned into a kind-looking elder. He landed about 50 to 60 meters away from Han Jin. Han Jin didn't move. He quietly observed Alquite. The minotaurs who were charging at him also tactfully retreated far away, leaving the battlefield. Lord Raphael, what are you waiting for? Alquite let out a sharp laugh. Are you waiting for me? Ha! It seems like you don't understand the abyss world at all. Alquite, ancestor of the blood race, I know you. Han Jin said calmly, but I'm still a lord. I can't just run away when I encounter a little trouble, right? You want me to leave? Sure, but you have to show me your fangs and claws first. Your confidence really surprises me. Alquite's face was slightly distorted. He thought of the few fallen angels that were within his reach. Even Zagund wouldn't dare. Zagund is Zagund, and I am me. Please don't compare us. Han Jin interrupted Alquite's words. Thank you. How rare. How rare. Alquite's long robe fluttered even though there was no wind. His pupils, which had shrunk to the size of a needle tip, suddenly enlarged. In the end, a strange red light ignited in his eyes. It's been a long, long time. Today, I finally met a little guy who dares to challenge me. If you want to defeat me or make me feel fear, you need to release your strength, not convince me with your mouth. Han Jin's gaze was like a knife. He met Alquite's gaze without any fear. I really can't understand. The famous ancestor of the blood race, Alquite, is actually an old thing who likes to talk nonsense. Chapter 289. The red light in Alquite's eyes suddenly dimmed, and at the same time, there was a heavy feeling in the flowing air. As Alquite's body turned into a series of faint afterimages, he instantly traversed a distance of tens of meters. His sharp claws extended, directly grabbing at Han Jin's throat. It was said that old bones and muscles were no longer useful, but the blood breed was a special kind of life. Every vampire was a natural warrior. Although Alquite had been dormant for many years, his explosive power, speed, and so on did not show any signs of deterioration. Han Jin did not move at all, as if he could not see this powerful attack. However, a white flame suddenly ignited in the air, blocking in front of his throat. Just as Alquite's fingertips were about to penetrate the white flame, he suddenly changed his strategy. He retracted his right claw and extended his left claw, aiming for Han Jin's heart. Another white flame appeared, blocking in front of Han Jin's chest. Alquite's body slid to the side like flowing water. His right claw flipped and stabbed at the back of Han Jin's neck. Han Jin deliberately angered Alquite in order to lure Alquite into launching a reckless attack, so that he could meet force with the 3 true fire he released. Now, it seemed that Alquite was not so easily fooled. Han Jin was slightly disappointed, but he did not have time to think too much. He released the 3 true fire again, blocking Alquite's attack. A sneer suddenly appeared on Alquite's face. He flicked his finger at the true samadhi fire. The true samadhi fire seemed to have been hit by something as it flew backward and hit the back of Han Jin's head, turning into a loud explosion of fire. The 3 true fire was controlled by divine telekinesis. No matter how powerful the explosion was, it would not cause any harm to Han Jin. However, Alquite's fingertips suddenly accelerated and approached the back of Han Jin's neck. Han Jin was shocked, but did not panic. Under the protection of the spirit possession technique, his reaction speed was also extremely fast. He dodged to the side and then sank into the ground. The next moment, Han Jin appeared a few dozen meters away. He touched the back of his neck with his hand, and when he retracted his hand was stained with blood. However, his expression was still calm, as if he was not the one who was injured. I heard from Guevara that there are some superclass masters who can materialize their spiritual energy. You're one of them, right? Lord Raphael, if your weapon is only this pitiful little flame, then I think we can call it a day. Alquite sneered and walked toward Han Jin step by step. And it's still early. Han Jin suddenly let out a clear whistle. A green light shot out and turned into a giant sword that was more than 10 meters long. Then, he moved his body and went straight towards Alquite. If a martial artist saw Han Jin's swordsmanship here, he might laugh his head off. However, he had to be able to see it clearly first. Han Jin did not have any achievements in swordsmanship. Although he had received guidance from Guevara, it was far from enough to make up for the huge gap. His swordsmanship only had one advantage. It was fast. Using his fingers to control the sword, his fingertips gently moved, and the giant sword slashed across the space of dozens of meters. Every time the sword swept out, it would turn the surroundings into a world of flying sand and stones. The sword light forcefully broke through the air barrier at a speed that exceeded the limit, bringing with it a deafening sound of wind and thunder. The Minotaurs in the distance could no longer see Han Jin's figure clearly. All they could see was endless waves of sword light. Each wave was fiercer than the last, and each wave was more dazzling than the last. It even gave them the illusion that it was going to devour the heavens and the earth. Alcuit's footsteps suddenly froze, and then he quickly retreated. Han Jin's sword light was too fast, and even with his eyesight, he could not catch its direction. He could only choose to avoid the sharp edge. Han Jin continued to charge forward, and Alcuit kept retreating. In the blink of an eye, Alcuit had retreated hundreds of meters. He did not know when, but his pale cheeks, which had not been exposed to light for a long time, had turned blood red. Being forced to retreat by a human was an unbearable humiliation to him. Alcuit's right claw clenched into a fist and slowly retracted until it could no longer retract. Then, he condensed his fist and punched forward. The condensed spiritual energy was like a giant iron awl, deeply embedded into the sword light. If the sword light released by Han Jin was an endless wave, then Alcuit's fist strength was a towering and unmoving reef. This was a pure confrontation of strength. With a loud explosion, the sword shadows that filled the sky suddenly disappeared. The sharp green light returned to its original state and flew into the sky like a piece of straw. Alcuit also took a few steps back. Alcuin took a deep breath. Then, his figure flashed forward and shot towards Han Jin like a bolt of lightning. Even with his strength, he still needed a few breaths' time to recover. He did not believe that his opponent could recover any faster. Han Jin flipped his left wrist, and a thread emitting light appeared out of thin air. It moved quickly and pounced towards Alcuit like a snake. Alcuit used the same trick again. With a flick of his finger, a spiritual feeler materialized and blocked the thread. Unexpectedly, the thread was not affected at all. It twisted slightly and wrapped around Alcuit's body. Alcuit screamed and grabbed the thread with his hand. Then he was stunned. He could see the thread, but he could not feel what he had grabbed. In a burst of colorful light, the thread had wrapped around Alcuit's body and began to tighten. Han Jin's figure moved. White balls of fire appeared in his palm and shot towards Alcuit like a string of bullets. In this life-or-death situation, Alcuit suddenly calmed down. Waves of spiritual energy that could not be seen by the naked eye were released with his body as the center. Boom! 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 A series of explosions sounded. A layer of spiritual energy appeared around Alcuit's body. Although the three true fires were sharp, they could not penetrate the spiritual energy barrier and cause harm to Alcuit. Seeing that the three true fires were ineffective, Han Jin's figure moved even faster. In the blink of an eye, he rushed in front of Alcuit and punched Alcuit's face. However, his fist was deflected by something extremely flexible, just like the three true fires. But Han Jin did not give up. He swung his fist with all his might and attacked like storm. The spinning green light, under the control of Han Jin's divine thoughts, quickly approached him. Alcuit's figure suddenly shot into the air like a cannonball. In the sharp, ear-piercing howl that resounded throughout the plains, the threads that bound Alcuit's body were forcibly pulled apart. However, they were still unstable. The threads tightened and expanded at times. It was obvious that the magic power of the immortal binding rope was in the final struggle with Alcuit's spiritual energy. Alcuit's figure was already enveloped by a dazzling light. At this moment, he did not have the aura of a fallen one from the abyss. Instead, he was like a god that had descended to the human world. Impossible. Han Jin was inexplicably shocked. However, now was not the time to think and analyze. He immediately made a gesture and appeared beside Alquite. He punched Alquite's chest. With another howl, Alquite's figure suddenly transformed into a silver bat and shot out like a bolt of lightning. The immortal binding rope that tightened instantly caught nothing but air. Then, it turned back into an inconspicuous thread. Han Jin let out an angry roar and made a gesture. Then, a white light chased after Alquite and hit him. A true warrior would never give up on his beliefs until the last breath. Moreover, Han Jin was very clear that when the blood breeds released their transformation technique, it was when they were at their weakest. The approaching green light swayed in the wind and turned into a giant sword that was more than 20 meters long. It carried the power of thousands of kilograms, but it silently slashed down. Sure enough, Alquite, who was shrouded by the pure light spell, let out a painful scream. It wasn't just pain. At this moment, he couldn't see or hear anything. Soon after, the giant sword landed on the silver bat's head. Blood spurted out. The silver bat fell to the ground like a stone and crashed heavily on the ground. However, Alquite had already returned to his original form. However, his injuries were still there. Streams of blood flowed from his forehead, down his cheeks, and dripped down his nose. He looked very miserable. At least, he was much more miserable than Han Jin. It's been a long time since someone made me so miserable, Alquite said softly. He quietly looked at the dripping blood. There was no anger in his eyes, only a trace of pity. Han Jin withdrew the immortal binding rope. He made a gesture and reappeared on the ground. Are you ready? Alquite's gaze turned to Han Jin. Han Jin used his fingertips to gently stroke the green light in front of him. He had a playful look on his face and did not say a word. Alquite opened his mouth and let out a deafening roar. Han Jin made a gesture at the same time. However, when the roar reached his ears, he suddenly felt his mind go blank. He forgot his goal, forgot his own Tao, and even forgot his own past and origin. The current Han Jin was like a person who had completely lost his memory. He could not remember anything. Alquite swung his right fist. An invisible fist energy whizzed towards Han Jin. As the fist energy approached, a shallow trench appeared on the ground, as if there was an invisible fish swimming in it. Han Jin's face showed a painful expression. He finally broke free from the blankness, but the fist energy was already in front of him. He pointed his finger, and the green light suddenly turned into a giant sword, blocking in front of him. With a boom, in the head-on collision, the giant sword was once again shattered and turned back into a looming green light. Han Jin was at a disadvantage twice in a row. This proved that in terms of pure strength, there was still a big gap between him and Alquite. The green light flew backwards. Han Jin raised his hand to catch his flying sword. The force attached to the flying sword made him take 2 steps back before he could stabilize his body. Alquite sneered. On the surface, he still looked at Han Jin with disdain, but in reality, he was really afraid. Han Jin's magic was too strange, and the magic tools he had were so mysterious and scary. He did not want to get close to Han Jin no matter what. Alquite roared again. Before the sound wave approached, Han Jin looked deeply at Alquite and sank into the ground. Chapter 290. In the silence, Han Jin slowly rose from the ground and looked behind him. You shameless rat. Alquite's angry roar rang in his ears. Han Jin couldn't help but smile. It wasn't that he didn't want to continue fighting, but that he had used up most of his vital energy. There was no point in continuing the fight. This time, he had taken advantage of Alquite. Although Alquite had injured him, he had also injured Alquite. Moreover, that terrifying mental attack at the end should be Alquite's trump card. In the next battle, he would definitely be fully prepared to deal with Alquite. Han Jin sat cross-legged on the ground and quietly adjusted his breathing. He needed to recover his fighting strength as soon as possible because this matter was not over yet. The biggest difference between the Abyss world and the surface was that there was no noise of life. When Han Jin entered a meditative state, the surroundings fell into a deathly silence. This was very beneficial to Han Jin as his breathing could be maximized. After an unknown amount of time, Han Jin slowly opened his eyes. He carefully sensed the movements in the distance, and then his body sank into the ground. After a few consecutive burrows, Han Jin's figure appeared behind a huge rock. A faint green light flickered, and with the help of the light, he could clearly see the slightly messy scene. There were bloodstains everywhere on the ground, as well as many torn pieces of cloth. Han Jin stretched out his hand and picked up some sand stained with blood. His gaze slowly turned to the high vault of the earth as he muttered to himself, "With such heavy injuries, where are they going? Could it be Fort Maxine? They really don't care about the strong people on the surface." In the next moment, Han Jin leaped into the air with his sword and shot straight towards the vault of the earth. His figure then disappeared without a trace. Han Jin's guess was wrong. Will and his brothers wanted to go to Fort Maxine not because they looked down on the strong people on the surface, but because they were worried about their little brother Zolof's safety. In fact, the brothers had already split into two factions. One side believed that since Lord Raphael had appeared underground, he must have taken over Fort Maxine, and Zolof was most likely dead. The other side believed that no matter what, they had to go and take a look. Neither side could convince the other, and in the end, Will, as the boss, made the final decision. Before tonight, Zagund still trusted Will and his brothers. Will knew that Zagund had personally formulated several counterattack plans, and Zagund's target was obviously the Bite Man. One of the plans was for Will and his brothers to lead elite Minotaurs and secretly infiltrate the Beatman's rear through a passage. They would wreak havoc and attract the Beatman's attention, creating an opportunity for the main battle. A year ago, Zagund had found an extremely good passage, but it seemed to have been discovered by the people on the surface. The evil eyes and Minotaurs that were scouting the way were all killed, and the passage was blocked. Zagund pretended that he didn't know anything in order to numb the vigilance of the people on the surface. He didn't send anyone to that passage again, but in reality, that passage had already become Zagund's most important secret. Will's memory was very good, and he didn't need a map at all. Which fork to take, which passage to choose, everything was firmly memorized in his mind. This was the last passage, and also the longest one. After walking for more than 10 miles, they would turn into the left fork, and it wouldn't take long for them to appear on the surface. Will sighed softly and turned back to look at his brothers. The others were still fine, but Keek's injuries were extremely serious. He could barely walk with the help of his brothers. This was also the reason why they hadn't set foot on the surface for a few days. In order to take care of Kiki, they couldn't casually use teleportation like before. Will had thought of leaving Kiki behind and leaving one of his brothers to take care of Kiki, but it was because he had sent Salav to Fort Maxine that Salav's life was in danger. He couldn't take the risk of being separated from his brothers again. "Boss, let's rest for a while," Lambert said, while looking at Kiki with a worried gaze. Keek's character was very tenacious. No matter how painful or tired he would still grit his teeth and endure. However, the stronger he appeared to be, the more his brothers felt sorry for him. "Let's walk a bit more, and then we can have a good rest after walking out of this passage," Will said softly. Lambert closed his mouth and silently followed behind while supporting Kiki. The other demons also didn't speak. Although they were more or less injured, walking wasn't a problem for them. Finally, they walked out of the long passage. Just as Will let out a sigh of relief, he suddenly clenched the giant scythe in his hand, and his expression became serious. A faint green light flickered in front of them, and a person wearing a black robe was sitting on the ground in a strange posture, as if waiting for something. With the help of the flickering green light, Will could clearly see the other's appearance. "Raphael, the Lord Raphael that Zagund spoke of. Sire, you're blocking our way," Will said word by word. Although there were 5 brothers by his side, Will didn't know why, but there was a faint expectation in his heart. He hoped that this meeting was just a coincidence and not a deliberate obstruction. "Where are you going?" Han Jin lightly raised his eyes and said in a gentle and calm voice, "For my direction. It seems that there is only one path." "Are you going to Bite Man?" "Sire, Where we're going seems to have nothing to do with you. Will coldly replied. Your way of thinking is really different. Han Jin revealed a smile. I am the Lord of the Bite Man. How can you think that I have nothing to do with your destination? Boss, why are you talking nonsense with this guy? Lambert came over and shouted from behind Will. Will suddenly turned his head, and under his gaze, Lambert angrily took a step back. Then, Will turned his head back and said softly, Sire, we're going to find our brothers. Please step aside. Salif? Han Jin paused. No need to go through so much trouble. I've already killed him with my own hands. The atmosphere suddenly fell into a deathly silence. Although he guessed that Salif must have met with misfortune, he didn't expect the other party to tell him the truth without hiding anything. So he couldn't wake up from the bad news for the time being. His eyes stared blankly at Han Jin. Guessing was one thing, but the truth was another. He refused to accept it. I'm sorry, but you have lost Salif forever. Han Jin lowered his eyes, as if he had entered a meditative state. So, you should go back and find Zagunt. This is what you should do. You want us to fight with Zaganide until both sides suffer? That's your real goal, isn't it? Will's cheeks, chest, and even his whole body were trembling slightly. The giant's scythe in his left hand was creaking, and his tone was extremely cold. Do you really think that we will listen to your orders? So, the negotiation has broken down? Han Jin smiled again. Raphael, you killed Salif. I will never let you go, never. Will gritted his teeth and said, The passing of life is irreversible. I sincerely advise you, don't be too impulsive. Han Jin slowly stood up, tidied up his robe, and looked at Will calmly. I have already grasped your fatal weakness. You still want to be enemies with me. Fatal weakness? Wei Pu laughed out loud, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. However, there was no joy in his laughter. Instead, it was filled with a miserable taste. So stubborn, your stupidity is far beyond my expectations. No wonder you lost to Zagunt. Han Jin no longer hid his contempt. Abyss demon? Hee, your true strength is not even comparable to a green dragon. The only thing you can rely on is teleportation. Will held the giant's scythe and looked coldly at Han Jin. As a top-grade creature, he had his own pride, and he would not let his fighting spirit collapse because of a few words. The two tunnels in front and behind, the highest point is not more than 4 meters, and the width is mostly about 3 meters. In this place, it is very difficult for you to freely wield your weapons, and your teleportation ability is also greatly limited. If I am careful enough, I only need to deal with one opponent. Isn't that right? Han Jin said as he looked around with satisfaction. Tell me, is there a more suitable battlefield than here? Will felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave, and he suddenly realized what was making him feel uneasy. The terrain here was too unfavorable for them. The opponent was only a human, and his height was only about 8 meters. This tunnel was like a prison, restricting their hands and feet, limiting their talents, and the opponent could release all of his fighting strength. Moreover, they had to take care of Kiki, and if a conflict really happened, it would not be good for them. And they did not know how long the opponent had been waiting here. Was he fully prepared? Not only did Will react, even the most impulsive Lambert was aware of the current danger. He took a few steps forward and squeezed in front of Will, and said in an angry voice, Boss, you guys go first. Leave this guy to me. Go. Go where? Will was a little stunned, and then he saw a few of his brothers supporting Kiki and retreating in the direction they came from. He could not help but show a miserable smile on his face. Yes, Zoloff was already dead. What was the point of going to the surface? He could only retreat to a safe place first, and then think of a way to take revenge later. Will patted Lambert's shoulder hard, but his eyes were fixed on Han Jin. After a while, he slowly retreated into the tunnel step by step. Han Jin seemed very quiet and tolerant, and did not interfere in any way. Compared with the threat full of killing intent just now, it gave a strong contrast. Lambert, of course, would not relax his vigilance for any reason, and he still stared at Han Jin without blinking, holding the giant's scythe tighter. After a long time, Han Jin raised his head. "They're gone. Those who should go have gone." Lambert snorted coldly, and his feet alternately retreated. He stepped forward only because of courage, and he also did not want to fight in this place. "You want to leave too? That won't do." Han Jin smiled and raised his hand to cast a spell. The tunnel behind Lambert suddenly shook violently, and more than 20 meters of the cave wall began to collapse, and the falling sand and stones instantly blocked the tunnel. Chapter 291. When the tunnel collapsed, Lambert's raised foot suddenly froze in place. He then changed direction, slowly but firmly stepping forward. The giant scythe in his hand was pointed at Han Jin, while he observed the battlefield from the corner of his eye. This was the junction of the three tunnels. There was one behind Lambert, which had already collapsed. There were two behind Han Jin, one of which led to the surface. As for the other, Lambert didn't know. He hadn't heard his brother mention it before. This place was wider than the tunnel, but it was limited. The height was about the same as the tunnel, and the harsh terrain meant that he could only attack with a horizontal slash. It was too disadvantageous. "I, the abyssal demon Lambert, accept your challenge." Lambert's ugly face was very serious, and he spoke word by word. "Challenge? No, this isn't a challenge." Han Jin revealed a smile that wasn't a smile. "The tunnel behind you is over 60 miles long. When you came here, you stopped twice. One was for a short rest, and the other was to sleep. Then you walked for half a day before you reached here. You immediately turned around and ran back. Haha, 60 miles. Do you think your brothers can escape?" "You? How did you know?" Lambert felt his heart clench. How could the enemy know the movements of his brothers so clearly? That was impossible. Abyssal demons were very good at capturing the opponent's aura in the boundless darkness. If someone was secretly spying on them, it would be impossible to hide from their senses. "Because I am a magician, a mysterious magician." Han Jin smiled. "Actually, you have a chance as long as you give up on your injured comrade. But I found that the relationship between you brothers is very deep. Giving up will be very difficult for you, won't it?" Lambert took a deep breath, then pursed his lips tightly. He suddenly took a large step forward, and the giant scythe in his hand whistled as it slashed towards Han Jin's neck. The fact that the other party chose this place to fight was filled with the smell of conspiracy. The most effective and best way to solve this problem was to kill Han Jin. He was willing to pay any price, even if it meant his life. Lambert's attack speed was extremely fast. As he raised his hand, the sharp scythe was already nearing Han Jin's neck. However, Han Jin's reaction speed wasn't slow either. Taking advantage of the momentum, he drifted back diagonally and then disappeared into the cave wall. This was the first time Lambert had seen Han Jin use earth meld up close. Seeing a living person melt into the earth, he couldn't help but be stunned. In the next moment, Han Jin had already charged out from behind Lambert. Lambert's pupils constricted, and without even turning his head, he thrust the hilt of his sword towards Han Jin's chest. Han Jin's figure came to a sudden stop, and he struck out with a backhand seal. A dazzling light suddenly exploded. Against the abyssal races, strong light was the best method of attack. Apart from the subterranean dwellers who were born blind, the other abyssal races would be greatly affected and even injured. If this had been a vast plain, the light from the explosion would have been quickly absorbed by the darkness. However, in this narrow space, the light was especially dazzling. The diffused light reflected off the cave walls, then diffused and reflected again, increasing the power of the cleansing light spell by several times. Lambert suddenly felt an unbearable pain in his eyes. He roared and swung his scythe around like a madman. Han Jin had already retreated into the tunnel, quietly watching as Lambert fought back and forth. His eyes couldn't see, and he couldn't lock on his space. Lambert had completely lost the ability to teleport, and he couldn't sense Han Jin's presence. In fact, he couldn't. Han Jin was only a magus in name. He didn't rely on magic, so naturally he couldn't speak of any magical power. Lambert roared again and again. His giant scythe danced like a windmill, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, sometimes to the left, and sometimes to the right. He didn't dare to slack off in the slightest, as if he was fighting against an invisible enemy. He knew that Hanjin must be hiding somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to strike. In this life and death situation, Lambert had already unleashed all of his battle prowess. The sharp giant scythe occasionally struck the cave wall, leaving a deep cut as if it was tofu. Of course, this would more or less cause some damage to the giant scythe, but Lambert couldn't care less about that. After an unknown amount of time, the dazzling light gradually dissipated. Lambert also noticed this. He abruptly retracted his scythe and forced his eyes open. At this moment, his eyes were already red and swollen, and his ugly face looked even more hideous. Hanjin's cleansing light spell had in some ways completely surpassed light magic. If it were an ordinary evil eye or Medusa, they would have long since been blinded. Continue. Hanjin smiled. With a flick of his wrist, another dazzling light shone. Lambert roared again and suddenly took a large step forward, his scythe stabbing towards Hanjin. However, Hanjin had already disappeared into the cave wall and appeared in another tunnel. Lambert stabbed empty air and quickly withdrew. Just like before, he madly brandished his scythe, surrounding himself with an impenetrable defense. Hundreds of deep slash marks had been left on the walls and ceiling of the cave. Lambert was like a diligent sculptor, but sculptors knew when they would be able to complete their work. Lambert, on the other hand, was struggling and working hard in the endless darkness. After a long while, the light gradually dimmed. Lambert took a few steps back and struggled to open his eyes. Perhaps it was because of fear, or perhaps it was because the stimulation he'd received was too intense, but Lambert's face was already covered in tears. His lips were trembling slightly, and the muscles on his face were completely distorted. His bloodshot eyes were filled with nothing but despair. "Don't stop." Hanjin formed a hand seal, his tone becoming increasingly gentle, as if he was comforting a frightened and pitiful creature. Lambert let out a sorrowful roar. During this short gap in space, he finally cast instant transmission and appeared in another tunnel. He then staggered forward. There was a lack of light in the tunnel, but the tunnel was built by the ancestors of the abyssal races, so of course they had to think for themselves. Some special alchemy potions were smeared on the walls of the tunnel, emitting an extremely dim light in the darkness, similar to phosphorescence. When they first arrived, Will and his brothers were able to clearly see their surroundings by relying on the faint light. But now it was different. Lambert had been stimulated by the pure light spell twice. Now, he had become blind and could not see anything. He only knew how to run forward, and run forward with all his might. He didn't know how far he had run, but Lambert suddenly bumped into something. He couldn't help but fall to the ground. Then he got up as fast as he could and used his broken arm to feel around. This scene was more or less desolate. Abyssal demon, the ruler of the abyss world. To actually fall to such a state, it was truly regrettable. After groping around for a while, Lambert suddenly understood that this was a path of no return. The road had been blocked. Lambert let out a howl of despair, his left hand frantically waving the scythe, frantically hacking at the sand in an attempt to dig a path for himself. If possible, he really wanted to give up his noble status, even if it meant turning into an ant, as long as he could avoid the terrifying enemy behind him. Unfortunately, the scythe was only a combat weapon, not suitable for digging. Although Lambert burst out with potential beyond his limits, slashing more than 20 times in the blink of an eye, the pile of sand still silently blocked his path. At this moment, a green light flashed behind him. Lambert suddenly turned his head, seeing a greatsword shooting towards him along the tunnel. The greatsword almost filled the entire tunnel, making it impossible for him to dodge. Lambert let out a howl and raised his scythe. The blade of the scythe had already pierced deep into the roof of the tunnel, and he swung it down with all his might. With a loud boom, the scythe forcefully sliced open the roof of the tunnel. Having used up much of his strength, Lambert was no longer able to contend with the power of the greatsword. His entire body was sent flying backwards, completely embedded into the pile of sand behind him. However, Lambert wasn't willing to be killed just like that. He struggled to jump up, but a dazzling ray of light suddenly rushed towards him, and he immediately closed his eyes. Just like the previous 2 times, no matter what kind of creature it was, the body's reaction was often mediated and transmitted through the nerves. When he saw the light and closed his eyes, the light had already caused him damage. It was just that his nerves hadn't reacted yet, so he couldn't feel the pain. The green light suddenly transformed into a small, nimble sword, stealthily stabbing into Lambert's chest. Lambert felt his heart grow cold and his consciousness blurred. The strength in his body seemed to be gradually fading away with something. His tall body slid down bit by bit, finally lying on the ground. However, Lambert's large mouth was still gasping for air. With a wave of his hand, Hanjin withdrew the green light, and then walked step by step towards Lambert. Lambert stared blankly at the ceiling. His breathing rate was very strange. Every time he inhaled, he would only take half a breath before stopping abruptly due to the pain. Then he exhaled deeply. Blood gushed out from the deep wound on his chest. In a short period of time, Lambert's body was dyed red. In the boundless darkness, Lambert suddenly heard a slightly mocking voice. I said, "This isn't a challenge." Then he felt a sharp pain in his forehead, and then he lost consciousness. In the next moment, Hanjin examined the magic crystal in his hand, which was still stained with blood. He casually wiped it and stored it in his space ring, and then his body shrunk back into the ground. The 5 brothers were still running forward with all their might, with Will personally bringing up the rear. As he ran, he looked back, hoping to see Lambert's figure. As time passed, his heart grew colder and colder, and he had an ominous premonition. Could it be? Lambert had already been killed. Impossible. Impossible. Will tightly gripped his scythe, his face constantly twisting. Damn it. If they were fighting on the open plains, how could a human? Just as Will thought of this, Hanjin's figure suddenly appeared, forcibly inserting himself in the middle of their group. Holding a green light in his hand, he stabbed towards the half-unconscious Kiki like lightning. At the same time, a dazzling light shone from Hanjin's left hand, illuminating the tunnel. Chapter 292. When a light exploded, the half-conscious Kiki couldn't resist at all. His eyes rolled to the back of his head, and he fainted on the spot. His companions cried out in pain as they covered their eyes with their right arms. Fei Rue, who was walking behind them, was also tall and big. This allowed Fei Rue and Wei Pu, who were at the very back, to avoid the misfortune of looking directly at the light source. Fei Rue was a man of few words, and he sat up slowly. However, his movements weren't slow at all. He immediately stretched out his right arm and pushed Kiki and his companions against the wall, giving him some space. Then, he took a step forward and stood in front of Kiki. He gripped his scythe tightly in his left hand and stabbed at Hanjin's position. Fei Rue's actions were completely instinctive. He had to protect his companions first before launching a counterattack. In fact, Hanjin's movements weren't that fast. He even paused for a moment before attacking the unconscious Kiki. The problem was that Hanjin's appearance was too sudden. Fei Rue's reaction was too complicated. By the time he pushed his companions to the side, Hanjin's flying sword had already arrived. He took a step forward to block the attack. Rather than saying that Hanjin was attacking him, it was more accurate to say that he was using his own body to block Hanjin's sword. Puffed. Blood splattered everywhere. Hanjin's green ray had already pierced through Fei Rue's left leg. He even made a mischievous move to the side and forcefully severed the muscles on the outside of Fei Rue's left leg, leaving behind a wound that was more than 10 centimeters deep. By the time Fei Rue's scythe arrived, he had already sunk into the ground and disappeared without a trace. Hanjin was a human through and through. No matter where his soul came from, his body's bloodline was extremely pure. However, in this world of the abyss, his survival ability was greater than any other race's. This was because he could be protected at any time. The dazzling light gradually dissipated. Fei Rue was already sweating from the pain, but he didn't make a sound. He only supported himself against the wall and slowly sat down on the ground. One of Fei Rue's companions saw that Fei Rue was injured and hurriedly came over to bandage his wound. Unfortunately, the wound was too deep. In just a short period of time, blood gushed out like a fountain and dyed Fei Rue's leg armor red. It even formed a small puddle on the ground. Raphael, bastard! Wei Pu roared. What did you do to Lambert? Tell me. No one else's reply. Only his own voice. Raphael, tell me. Tell me. Tell me. You guys go. Fei Rue used the handle of his scythe to push his companions to the side. He then threw the scythe away and hugged the unconscious Kiki in his arms. Leave Kiki to me. Wei Pu suddenly turned to look at Fei Rue. Another demon roared. Fei Rue, what do you mean? Yeah, Fei Rue, why are you telling us to go? Another demon cried out while rubbing his eyes. He could have killed Kiki, but he didn't. He could have killed me, but he didn't. Fei Rue softly said, Boss, don't you understand what he's trying to do? Go. It'll be too late if we don't leave now. Wei Pu froze. He had watched Fei Rue grow up. In his memory, he had never heard Fei Rue speak so much at once. However, he understood what Fei Rue was trying to say. Their eyes met. One pair of eyes was filled with conflict and sorrow, while the other pair of eyes was bidding farewell, confiding, and entrusting. Time seemed to have frozen. Go! Fei Rue suddenly roared. Wei Pu no longer hesitated. He turned around and immediately released instant transmission. The next moment, he appeared dozens of meters away. He then released instant transmission again. Those with the best eyesight could see that when Wei Pu's figure moved, a few drops of water were thrown out from his face. Boss, you! A demon stared at Wei Pu's back in disbelief. Their elder brother, the one who had always protected them, had actually become a deserter. The human wants to use me and Kiki to hold you guys back. Fei Rue wanted to laugh, but the intense pain in his leg prevented him from doing so. Gary, you can only avenge us if you're alive. Do you understand? Go. But Gary bit his lip. Fei Rue's words were so straightforward that he naturally understood. However, he still wanted to try and take Fei Rue and Kiki with him. The other demon suddenly turned around and teleported a few steps away, disappearing into the depths of the tunnel. You mother of asterisk cur. Fei Rue was so angry that he cursed. He picked up the scythe he had thrown on the ground and waved it around. Scram. If you don't scram, I'll kill you. At that moment, Han Jin's figure suddenly appeared beside Gary. The green glow in his hand pierced towards Gary's heart at a tricky angle. However, this time was different from before. Gary was already on high alert. As soon as Han Jin appeared, Gary immediately teleported to where his brother had disappeared. He turned around and glared at Han Jin. Then, he turned around and teleported again. Han Jin stood motionless. He tilted his head as if he was listening to something. In reality, he was using the guidance talisman to calculate and judge the distance between him and the demons, as well as their movement speed, to decide whether he should chase after them. After a while, Han Jin gave up. He definitely wouldn't be able to catch up with them using Earth Meld. However, if he used the Earth Shrinking spell, he could try. The problem was that the demons could teleport continuously. They only appeared for an instant, and he couldn't determine where the demons would appear. In such a short time, it would be difficult to launch an effective attack unless one of the demons automatically bumped into him. After abandoning their brothers, the demon's speed increased exponentially. 60 miles sounded very far, but to the demons, it wouldn't take long to escape. Once they exited the tunnel, they would arrive at a wide stone forest. In that place, it was hard to say who would kill who. You're very smart. Han Jin turned his gaze to Fei Rue. If you were their elder brother, perhaps you would have taken a different path. This is my fate. It's not a big deal. Perhaps it was because he found the smile on Han Jin's face particularly detestable, or perhaps it was because he wanted to make up for the regrets of this life. Fei Rue was very talkative. He coldly said, "Don't be too happy. Do you think you'll have a last laugh?" "I will. At least I'll work hard." Han Jin's smile didn't change. "As for you, you don't even have the right to work hard." Han Jin indeed wanted to use the Will brothers' feelings to delay their escape. He wanted to slowly exhaust them in the long tunnel. Who knew that Fei Rue would see through his intentions, and the cowardly Will would immediately run away? Han Jin was very disappointed. Although his tone was still as gentle as usual, his words were as sharp as nails. One could even say that they were vicious. "You hate us? That's hard to understand," Fei Rue coldly said. "You were the one who killed Zoloff. It should be us who hate you. The seeds of hatred have already been planted. It's either I kill all of you, or you kill me." Han Jin smiled. "Of these two outcomes, I think anyone would choose the former. Because you killed Zoloff, you hate us and want to kill us all." Fei Rue finally laughed. "Lord Raphael, don't you think you're too cruel and shameless?" "Cruel?" Han Jin thought for a moment and laughed. "When I first came to this world, I also wanted to be a civilized and polite child. The cruel one isn't me, it's this world. I couldn't even fill my stomach. I could only watch as my only servant was bullied. Then, a random army came and waved their knives at us. They even set a fire and burned down our home. I wandered around and became a mercenary. In the end, people casually accused us of a crime and wanted to kill us. We resisted and escaped. Then, I saw groups of vampires killing innocent humans for no reason, just for fun. I experienced many dangers, I was injured, and I lost a very good friend. From all of this, I finally understood what the real law of survival in this world is." The muscles on Fei Rue's face twitched. After a while, he said in a trembling voice, "You are not from this world. As an abyss demon, you should know more about this than I do." "Cruel? How can you say something so childish?" Han Jin revealed a mouthful of white teeth and smiled. "The famous 7 brothers of Whip. How many lives have been destroyed by your hands? Ha! Even your own race can't tolerate you. Cruel and shameless. I'll leave that to you. In reality, I'm a very, very good person. At least, I explained so much to you before I killed you, didn't I? You? Who are you? Where did you come from?" Fei Rue roared. "I'm not telling you." Han Jin chuckled, as if he was joking with an old friend. However, his actions were not joking at all. The green light in his hand drew an afterimage in the air and shot directly toward Fei Rue's chest. Fei Rue's figure disappeared from the spot. After pausing for a moment, he appeared behind Han Jin. The giant scythe whistled through the air as it slashed toward Han Jin's legs. If Fei Rue's combat strength was still at its peak, this strike would be a huge threat to Han Jin. However, he was lying on the ground and had lost too much blood. The speed and power of the strike were affected. Han Jin even had enough time to form a hand seal and release the ground-shrinking curse. He appeared behind Fei Rue and kicked him in the ribs. The 3-meter-tall body was flattened like a piece of straw and was sent flying. It scraped against the walls of the cave a dozen times before it landed heavily on the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Did it work?" Han Jin said softly. He then waved his hand, and the flying sword that had missed its target glowed once again. In the next moment, it slashed through the unconscious Keek's throat and shot toward Fei Rue, accompanied by a trail of blood. Fei Rue raised his giant scythe with difficulty to block the green light. However, the green light suddenly stopped and dodged Fei Rue's scythe. Then, it suddenly accelerated and shot toward Fei Rue. Fei Rue was already at the end of his rope and couldn't deal with this sudden change in attack. In the next instant, the green light pierced through Fei Rue's nose and through his skull, pinning him to the ground. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.